My phone rang at 8 a.m. sharp, cutting through the morning silence of the lake house like a siren. I looked at the caller ID. It was my daughter, Jasmine. I picked up, expecting the usual request for money or perhaps a complaint about her husband's latest failed investment. But her voice was different this time. It was cold-clipped and terrifyingly efficient. "Dad, Grandpa Jasper died last night," she said. There were no tears, no hesitation, just a flat statement of fact. He had a massive stroke in his sleep at the Atlanta house. The paramedics couldn't do anything. I froze the coffee mug hovering halfway to my mouth. I looked across the small wooden table. Sitting right there in his favorite rocking chair was my father, Jasper. He was very much alive. He was holding his own mug of black coffee, reading the financial news on his tablet with the sharp, focused eyes of a hawk. He looked up at me as I answered the phone, his eyebrows raising slightly in a silent question. I didn't say a word to him. I just listened to my daughter lie to me about the death of the man sitting 3 feet away. There is no will. Jasmine continued, her voice gaining a strange manic energy. I checked with his lawyers. Since he died intestate and you are living in, well, your condition, the court will appoint me as the legal guardian of the estate. I have already filed the paperwork this morning. Before I could even process the audacity of the lie, the phone was snatched away on the other end. I heard a scuffle and then the sneering, arrogant voice of my son-in-law, Blake. "Listen to me, Rufus." Blake spat into the receiver. I could practically smell the stale bourbon on his breath through the phone line. The old man is dead, and frankly, it is a blessing. We were tired of waiting. Now listen carefully, because I'm only going to say this once. You get nothing. Zero. I said nothing. I simply reached out and pressed the speakerphone button. I placed the phone gently in the center of the table between the sugar bowl and my father's hand. Jasper stopped scrolling on his tablet. He placed it face down. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing into 2 slits of cold, hard fury. Blake continued, unaware that the ghost he was insulting was listening to every word. "We are cutting off your monthly aid, Rufus. That $500 you beg for every month, it is over. We need that money to maintain the estate until we can liquidate it. And speaking of liquidation, you need to clear out of that shack by the lake. We are listing the land for sale next week." I looked at my father. His hand, weathered and strong, clenched into a fist on the table. It wasn't the tremble of age. It was the vibration of pure, unadulterated rage. "My name is Rufus. I am 68 years old. To the world, and apparently to my own ungrateful daughter, I am just a retired military engineer living out my final days in a rundown cabin, scraping by on a meager pension and the charity of my family. They look at my faded flannel shirts and my 20-year-old pickup truck, and they see a failure. They see a black man who worked with his hands his whole life and has nothing to show for it but calluses and a small Social Security check. They have no idea who I really am. They have no idea that the cabin is not the only property on this lake I own. They have no idea that the monthly $500 they send me is a test they have failed every single month for the last 10 years by complaining about it. And they certainly have no idea that my father Jasper is not a senile old man rotting away in an Atlanta mansion. He is a 92-year-old shark who built a construction empire from the dirt up in the Jim Crow South, a man who has forgotten more about business warfare than Blake will ever know. And right now they think he is dead. Jasmine came back on the line. Her voice was smoother now, trying to sound reasonable, which made it even more sickening. "Dad, you have to understand. Blake is right. That cabin is an eyesore. It devalues the land. We have buyers lined up for the acreage. You can go to the shelter in town or maybe apply for state housing. Honestly, it is time you stood on your own 2 feet. You have been a burden on us for too long. A burden." I looked around the cabin. It was simple, yes. Rustic. But it was built with solid oak and paid for with cash 40 years ago. I didn't need their $500. I deposited every single check they sent into a savings account for my granddaughter, hoping that one day the money would do some good. I let them believe I needed it because I wanted to see if they would care for me when I had nothing. "Jasmine," I said, keeping my voice steady, betraying nothing. "You are sure he is dead? You saw the body." "Of course I saw him." She snapped her lie, coming instant and sharp. "I identified him myself this morning. It was tragic, Dad. His face was twisted. It was definitely a stroke. We already sent him to the crematorium. It was what he wanted. No funeral, no viewing, just a quick cremation. My father's eyes went wide. Cremation. They were trying to destroy the evidence of a body that didn't exist. They were trying to erase him from the earth so they could claim his $8 million estate before the weekend was over. And the house in Atlanta, I asked. We are handling it, Blake interrupted. We are going there now to secure the assets. We don't want looters breaking in. We are changing the locks and shutting down the security system. Don't even think about driving down there, Rufus. The guards won't let you in. You are not on the list anymore. You are nobody. The cruelty was breathtaking. It wasn't just greed, it was hatred. Blake had always looked down on us. He tolerated Jasmine because she was beautiful and because he thought she came from money. But he despised me. He despised my history, my skin, my silence. He thought my silence was submission. He was about to learn that silence is also how a predator hunts. So that is it, I asked softly. You are throwing me out on the street the day my father dies. It is business. Rufus, Blake laughed, a dry, humorless sound. Don't take it personally, although honestly it is a little personal. I have always hated visiting that damp-smelling cabin. Consider this a favor. We are freeing you from your misery. Now don't call us again. We will send you the eviction notice via email. The line went dead. The silence that followed was heavier than the humid air outside. I looked at the phone screen as it turned black. I looked at my father. Jasper sat motionless for a long moment. Then he slowly picked up his coffee mug and took a long, deliberate sip. He placed the mug back down with a soft thud that echoed in the quiet room. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. He simply reached into the pocket of his cardigan and pulled out a handkerchief to wipe his mouth. "Did you hear that, son?" Jasper asked. His voice was gravel and iron. "I heard it pop," I replied. "They think I am dead," he mused, looking out the window at the calm waters of the lake. "They think I am ash in a jar, and they think you are a beggar they can kick to the curb." He turned his gaze to me. His eyes were not the eyes of a 92-year-old man. They were the eyes of the man who had stared down bank managers in the 60s who refused him loans, the man who had built skyscrapers when they told him he should be sweeping floors. They were eyes full of cold, calculating fire. "They want a ghost," Jasper said, a small, terrifying smile touching the corners of his lips. "Then I will be a ghost that haunts them until they have nothing left but the clothes on their backs." He reached for his phone, a burner flip phone that only 3 people in the world had the number for. He dialed a number from memory. "Who are you calling?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "Mercer," Jasper said. Mercer was my old war buddy, a man who had served with me in the engineering corps. But unlike me, who had retreated into a quiet life, Mercer had gone to law school. He was now one of the most vicious, effective corporate attorneys in the state. He was the only man outside of this room who knew the true extent of our assets. Mercer picked up on the second ring. Jasper didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Mercer," he said. "It is Jasper. I need you to open the war room file. Yes, right now. My granddaughter just declared me dead." I could hear the muffled sound of Mercer's voice on the other end, confused and shocked. "No, I am not dead," Jasper barked. "I am sitting here drinking coffee, but according to the county records, or at least according to my granddaughter's plan, I died last night of a stroke. She is claiming guardianship. She is moving on the Atlanta house, and that husband of hers just told Rufus to find a cardboard box to live in." Jasper paused, listening to Mercer. Then he nodded. "Do it," Jasper commanded. "Pull the death certificate she filed. I want to know who signed it. I want to know which doctor sold his soul for a few $1,000s. And Mercer." He waited for the acknowledgement. "Let them in. Do not stop them from entering the Atlanta house. Let them break the locks. Let them think they have won. I want them to feel the gold in their hands before I turn it into molten lead. And freeze the main accounts, but do it silently. Let them see the balance, but give them an error message when they try to transfer. Make them sweat." He hung up the phone and looked at me. "Get the truck, Rufus," he said, standing up with a surprising amount of strength. "We are going into town." "Where are we going?" I asked, grabbing my keys. "To my own funeral," Jasper said, buttoning his cardigan. "If I am dead, I might as well enjoy the show. And we need to find out exactly how deep in debt those 2 fools are. People don't commit felonies like faking a death certificate unless they are desperate. We are going to find out who holds their leash, and then we are going to buy the leash." I walked out to the truck, the morning sun hitting my face. I felt a strange sensation in my chest. It wasn't sadness. It was the adrenaline of combat. For years I had played the role of the quiet, passive father. I had let them disrespect me because I wanted to keep the peace. I wanted to believe that somewhere deep down, Jasmine was still the little girl I had carried on my shoulders. But that girl was gone. She had been replaced by a woman who would bury her living grandfather to pay for a lifestyle she couldn't afford. She had married a man who treated her father like trash because of the color of his skin and the size of his bank account. I started the engine of my old Ford. It roared to life, a rough, reliable sound. Jasper climbed into the passenger seat. He looked at me and nodded. "Drive," he said. As we pulled onto the dirt road, leaving the sanctuary of the cabin behind, I knew one thing for certain. By the time this week was over, Jasmine and Blake would wish that Jasper really had died. Because the man sitting next to me was about to teach them a lesson that no amount of money could fix. They wanted an inheritance. We were about to give them one they would never forget. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The drive to Mercer's office was quiet. The silence was thick with the realization of what we were about to do. We weren't just fighting back. We were dismantling my daughter's life. But she had fired the first shot. She had declared us dead and homeless. When we arrived at the law firm, we didn't use the main entrance. We parked in the back near the loading dock where Mercer met us. He was a tall man, his hair graying at the temples, wearing a suit that cost more than Blake's car. He hugged me, then shook Jasper's hand firmly. "You look good for a corpse," Mercer said, a grim smile on his face. "I feel better than I look," Jasper replied. "What did you find?" Mercer led us into his private office and pulled up a document on his large monitor. It was a digital copy of a death certificate. "They didn't waste time," Mercer said, pointing at the screen. "Filed at 7 a.m. this morning. Cause of death, myocardial infarction. Place of death, your residence in Atlanta. Witness Jasmine King. And the signing physician, a Dr. P.J. Miller." "I know him," I said, leaning in. "He runs a pill mill clinic on the south side. He lost his license for 6 months last year for insurance fraud. He is cheap and he is dirty," Mercer agreed. "Perfect for a rush job. But here is the interesting part. I ran a preliminary credit check on your daughter and her husband." He clicked a few keys and a new window popped up. It was a sea of red ink. "They are drowning," Mercer said. "They owe $500,000, not to banks, to private lenders. Crypto losses, gambling debts, and a lifestyle that requires $20,000 a month just to keep the lights on. They have a balloon payment due in 7 days. If they don't pay, they lose their house, their cars, everything." "So that is the timeline," Jasper said, his eyes cold. 7 days. They need my money in 7 days or they are finished. "That is why they killed you on paper," I said. "Probate takes too long. They need to access the accounts immediately as guardians or trustees." "Exactly," Mercer said. "And right now they are driving to your bank. My contact there just alerted me. Jasmine is trying to access your safe deposit box." Jasper leaned back in the leather chair, steepling his fingers. "Let them try," he said softly. "Let them walk right up to the vault. Tell the manager to play along. Show them the box. Let them see the envelopes. But tell them the master key is jammed. Tell them it will take 48 hours to drill it." "Why delay them?" I asked. "Because panic makes people stupid," Jasper replied. "And when they are stupid, they make mistakes. I want them terrified. I want them spending money they don't have yet. I want them to dig a hole so deep that they can never climb out." He looked at me. "Rufus, get the recording equipment ready. Tonight they are going to break into the Atlanta house. I want every word, every insult, every act of vandalism recorded in high definition. If they want to steal my life, I am going to make sure the jury has a front row seat." We left Mercer's office with a plan. The game was on. My daughter had declared war on the wrong men. She thought she was dealing with a senile old man and a helpless pauper. She was about to find out that she was fighting 2 soldiers who had been holding the high ground for decades. As we drove back toward the city, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Blake. "Don't bother coming to the funeral. It's private. We'll send you the ashes in the mail." I read it to Jasper. He didn't laugh. He just stared ahead at the road, his face set in stone. "Reply to him," Jasper said. "What should I say?" "Tell him understood. I hope the inheritance is worth it." I typed the words and hit send. The trap was set. Now we just had to wait for them to walk into it. Mercer slid the document across the polished mahogany desk, and the sound of the paper sliding against the wood was the only noise in the room. I looked down at the sheet that was supposed to mark the end of a life. It was a standard state death certificate, cold and bureaucratic, stamped with the official seal of Fulton County. At the top right corner in bold black ink was the file number 7789B. I stared at it for a long time. My eyes traced the lines where it listed the deceased. Jasper King. Date of death yesterday. Cause of death acute myocardial infarction. It was a lie printed on government stationery. I looked up at my father. Jasper was sitting in the leather chair next to me, very much alive, his chest rising and falling with a steady rhythm that defied the document in front of me. He reached out with a steady hand and picked up the paper. He read his own death notice without blinking. His face was a mask of stone, but I knew him well enough to see the muscle twitching in his jaw. He was not afraid. He was insulted. To him, this piece of paper was not just a crime. It was an act of supreme disrespect. "Who signed this?" Mercer asked, his voice low and dangerous. I pointed to the signature line at the bottom. Dr. P.J. Miller. Mercer nodded slowly. Of course, Miller. The man is a disgrace to the medical profession. He lost his license twice for overprescribing opioids, and now he is running a cash-only clinic out of a strip mall. He would sign a death warrant for a ham sandwich if you paid him enough cash. I felt a wave of nausea roll through me. My daughter had not just lied. She had gone out and found a corrupt doctor, paid him a bribe, and orchestrated a federal crime before the sun had even come up. She had looked at her grandfather, the man who had paid for her first car, the man who had bounced her on his knee, and she had decided he was worth more as a corpse than as a person. She had erased 92 years of life struggle and triumph with a single signature from a crooked doctor. "This is a felony," I said, my voice thick with rage. "This is fraud. This is conspiracy." "It is all of that," Mercer agreed. "But why the rush? Why did they need him dead this morning? Why couldn't they wait for nature to take its course?" "That is the question," Jasper said, tossing the death certificate back onto the desk with contempt. "Find out what they owe Mercer. Find out who holds the leash." Mercer turned to his computer. His fingers flew across the keyboard. He had access to databases that most people didn't even know existed. We sat in silence for 10 minutes, watching the reflection of the city skyline in the window. Finally, Mercer stopped typing. He let out a long, low whistle. "You were right, Jasper," Mercer said, turning the screen so we could see. "They are not just in debt, they are buried." I leaned in to look at the numbers. It was a financial autopsy of my daughter and son-in-law. It was worse than I could have imagined. Jasmine and Blake were drowning in $500,000 of debt, but it wasn't a mortgage, it wasn't student loans, it was high-interest short-term debt from private lenders. Mercer pointed to a line item. "This is a hard money loan from a shell company linked to the syndicate. They borrowed $200,000 to cover losses in a cryptocurrency scam Blake got sucked into. The interest rate is 40% a week. They have missed the last 3 payments." I looked further down. There were gambling debts from online casinos. There were lease payments on a luxury SUV they couldn't afford. There were credit card bills maxed out on designer clothes and 5-star dinners. They had been living like royalty on a beggar's budget, terrified that the house of cards would fall. "And here is the kicker," Mercer said, tapping the screen. "The hard money lenders have given them a deadline. They have 7 days, 1 week. If they don't come up with the full principal plus interest by next Friday, the lenders seize everything. The house, the cars, their reputation. And knowing these types of lenders, they might come for more than just assets. They might come for blood." "That explains the haste," Jasper said, his voice devoid of sympathy. "They needed access to the estate immediately. Probate court takes months. But if I am dead, and Jasmine is the sole heir and guardian, she can try to leverage the inheritance. She can try to get a bridge loan against the estate. They are trying to liquidate me to save themselves," Jasper said. "They are selling my bones to pay for their mistakes. It wasn't just greed, it was desperation. They were cornered rats. And cornered rats bite. They needed cash, and they needed it today." Just then, Mercer's private line rang. He answered it, listened for a moment, and a small, cruel smile played on his lips. He put the phone on speaker. "Mr. Mercer," the voice on the line whispered. "This is Henderson at the main branch. You told me to alert you if anyone tried to access the King safe deposit box." "Is she there?" Mercer asked. "She is in the lobby right now," Henderson said. "Jasmine King. She has a death certificate and a notarized affidavit claiming she is the executor. She is demanding access to box number 402. She is making a scene. She says it is urgent. Let her in," Jasper commanded from across the desk. Henderson paused, surprised to hear Jasper's voice. "Mr. King." "Do as I say," Henderson Jasper said firmly. Escort her to the vault. Let her use her key. Let her see the box. Let her see the bonds inside. Let her touch them. Let her think she has won." And then what Henderson asked. "Then tell her the system is down," Jasper said. "Tell her there is a freeze on the box due to a digital error. Tell her the federal banking regulations require a 48-hour hold on deceased accounts for verification. Tell her anything you want, but do not let her take a single sheet of paper out of that bank." "Understood," Henderson said. I could picture the scene perfectly. Jasmine, dressed in black, feigning grief, standing in the marble lobby of the bank. She would be sweating under her makeup. She would be looking at the clock, thinking about the debt collectors, thinking about the 7-day deadline. We stayed on the line, listening to the muffled sounds of the bank lobby through Henderson's open phone. We heard the heavy clank of the vault door opening. We heard the slide of the metal box. We heard Jasmine gasp. She had seen the contents. There were bearer bonds in there worth $50,000. Not millions, but enough to hold off the sharks for a week. Enough to buy them time. "I need to take these now." Jasmine's voice came through high and tight. "I need to convert these." "I am sorry," Ms. King Henderson's voice was smooth and professional. "The system is flagging a code red. It seems there is a discrepancy with the death certificate number." "What discrepancy?" Jasmine shrieked. "It is official. Look at the seal. The system is automated," Ma'am Henderson lied beautifully. "It freezes the assets automatically when there is a mismatch. I cannot override it. The vault is locking down. I have to put the box back." "No," Jasmine screamed. It wasn't a word. It was a primal sound of pure panic. "You can't do this. I need this today. Do you know who I am? My grandfather built this city." "I am afraid you have to leave the vault," Ma'am Henderson said. "Security, please escort Ms. King to the lobby." We heard the sound of a struggle, the sound of heels clicking frantically on the floor, and then the sound of Jasmine slamming her hand against a desk. "This is ridiculous," she yelled. "I will sue this bank. I will sue all of you." The line went dead. Jasper leaned back in his chair. He took a sip of his coffee, which had gone cold, but he didn't seem to notice. "She is desperate," Jasper said softly. "And a desperate enemy is a careless enemy. She thinks it is a glitch. She thinks it is bad luck. She doesn't know she is walking into a cage." "Rufus," my father said, turning to me. "They didn't get the money from the bank. That means they will go for the next best thing. They are going to the Atlanta house. They think there is cash hidden in the walls. They think there is jewelry in your mother's vanity. They are going to loot the place," I said, feeling the anger rising again. "Let them," Jasper said. "We have cameras in every room. I want you to go to the security room in the guest house. I want you to record everything. Every vase they break, every picture they smash, every hateful word they say about us. We are building a case, son, and tonight they are going to give us the evidence we need to put them away forever." We left Mercer's office and got back into my truck. The city skyline loomed ahead, but my mind was on the house where I grew up. The house my father had built with his own hands. The house my daughter was about to desecrate. She thought she was fighting for her inheritance. She didn't realize she was fighting for her freedom, and she was already losing. I sat in the security room of the guest house, my eyes glued to the bank of high-definition monitors that lined the wall. Beside me, Jasper sat in his wheelchair, his posture rigid, his hands gripping the armrests so tightly his knuckles were white. We were watching a crime unfold in real time. We were watching the invasion of our sanctuary. On screen 3, a black luxury SUV screeched to a halt in front of the main entrance of the Atlanta estate. It was Jasmine and Blake. They didn't even try to ring the doorbell. They didn't call a locksmith. They didn't show an ounce of respect for the property they claimed was theirs. Blake stepped out of the driver's side holding a heavy tire iron. He walked up to the custom mahogany double-doors doors that my father had carved himself 50 years ago and jammed the metal bar into the seam. I watched the wood splinter. I watched him heave his weight against it. With a sickening crack, the lock gave way and the door swung open. They walked in like conquering warlords entering a defeated city. Jasper let out a low growl, but he didn't look away. He wanted to see this. He needed to see this. On screen 1, the interior camera picked them up as they stepped into the grand foyer. Blake didn't wipe his feet. He tracked mud and grease across the hand-woven Persian rug that my mother had loved. He looked around the soaring atrium with a sneer of absolute contempt. "Look at this place!" Blake spat, his voice captured clearly by the sensitive microphones we had installed. It smells like old people and mothballs. It smells like poverty trying to dress up as wealth. Jasmine walked in behind him, her eyes scanning the room not for memories but for value. She ignored the family portraits on the walls. She ignored the history. "We are going to have to gut this entire floor," Blake continued, kicking an antique vase that stood near the entrance. It shattered into 100 pieces. Trash. Absolute trash. Who decorates with tribal art anymore? It is tacky, Jasmine. We need to rip all this dark wood out. We need white marble. We need glass. We need to put a pool right in the middle of this living room. We need to erase the fact that your grandfather ever lived here. I felt a heat rise in my chest that was so intense it almost blinded me. Blake wasn't just talking about renovation. He was talking about erasure. He looked at my father's legacy, the architecture that celebrated our heritage, and he called it tacky. He called it trash. He wanted to whitewash our history because he felt superior to it. He was standing in a house worth $8 million, a house he hadn't paid a dime for, and he was treating it like a tear down in the slums. Jasper reached out and touched my arm. His hand was cold. "Let them talk, Rufus," he whispered. "Let them show us exactly who they are. Do not look away." Jasmine didn't even flinch at her husband's insults. She was too busy calculating. She walked straight past the living room and headed for the stairs. "Forget the furniture, Blake," she shouted over her shoulder. "The real money is upstairs. Grandpa didn't trust banks. He kept cash. He kept Grandma's jewelry. That is what we need. That is what will pay the sharks by Friday." They stomped up the stairs, their footsteps heavy and disrespectful, echoing through the empty house. They were not grieving heirs. They were looters. They were pirates. And they had no idea the captain of the ship was watching every move they made. We switched our attention to the monitor displaying the master bedroom. This was the Holy of Holies. This was the room where my parents had shared 50 years of marriage. It was preserved exactly as it was when my mother Viola passed away. Her perfume bottles were still on the vanity. Her reading glasses were still on the nightstand. It was a shrine to a love that Jasmine and Blake would never understand. Jasmine burst into the room like a hurricane. She didn't pause to honor the space. She went straight for the dresser. She pulled the drawers out one by one, dumping the contents onto the floor. My father's clothes, my mother's silk scarves, they were all thrown into a heap like garbage. "Where is it?" Jasmine screamed, her voice rising in panic. "Where is the safe? Where is the cash?" She moved to the closet, tearing clothes off hangers, pushing aside boxes of old letters. She was frantic. She was sweating. The desperation of the debt collectors was breathing down her neck, and it was making her vicious. Blake stood in the doorway watching her. "You said he was rich, Jasmine. You said he hoarded gold." "He did," Jasmine yelled, throwing a jewelry box across the room. It hit the wall and popped open. It was empty. There was nothing inside but a few costume pieces and a note from my father to my mother written on their 40th anniversary. Jasmine didn't even read it. She kicked it aside. "He was a liar," she shrieked. "He was a cheap, lying old miser. He pretended to be this great businessman, but look at this. There is nothing here. He probably spent it all, or maybe he buried it in that stupid cabin with your loser father." She turned her rage toward the nightstand. There was a framed photograph there. It was my favorite picture of my parents taken on the day they broke ground on their first major building project. They looked young and strong and full of hope. Jasmine picked it up. She looked at the face of the grandfather who had paid for her college tuition, who had bought her first car. "Useless old man," she hissed. And then she threw it. She threw the picture with all her might against the hardwood floor. The glass shattered with a sound that felt like a gunshot in the silent security room. She stomped on the broken frame, grinding her heel into the photograph, tearing the image of my father's face. "I hate him!" she screamed, tears of frustration streaming down her face. "I hate him for dying without leaving me cash. I hate him for making me work for this. I hate this whole family. Why couldn't we be normal? Why couldn't we just have a trust fund like everyone else?" I looked at Jasper. A single tear rolled down his cheek, losing itself in the deep lines of his face. It wasn't a tear of sadness, it was a tear of finality. That picture was his most prized possession, and his granddaughter had just destroyed it because she couldn't find a stack of $100 bills to pay for her husband's gambling debts. "That is it," Jasper said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "She is dead to me. The girl I raised is gone. That thing on the screen is a stranger." Blake walked over to her and grabbed her shoulders. "Stop it," he commanded. "Stop throwing a tantrum. If there is no cash, we sell the asset. We sell the house. We can't sell the house, Jasmine sobbed. It takes months. We have days. We don't need months, Blake said, a dangerous glint in his eyes. We need a cash buyer. We need a flipper. We sell it cheap. We sell it fast. He pulled his phone out of his pocket. I watched on the screen as he dialed a number. I knew exactly who he was calling. It was a sleazy real estate broker named Tony, a man known for buying distressed properties for pennies on the dollar and asking no questions. I turned up the volume on the console. I needed to hear the price. I needed to hear the value they placed on my father's life work. Tony Blake said into the phone, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. It is Blake. Listen, I have a property. No, not a foreclosure. It is an inheritance. A massive estate in Buckhead. 8,000 square feet, 5 acres. He paused, listening to the voice on the other end. Yeah, I know the market value, Blake said. It is appraised at $8 million. But I don't want $8 million. I want $2 million cash. Wire transfer. Today. I gasped. $2 million. The land alone was worth $4 million. The art inside was worth another $1 million. He was selling a legacy for the price of a teardown just to save his own skin. Yes, I have the deed, Blake lied smoothly. I am the executor. My wife is the sole heir. The old man kicked the bucket yesterday. We just want to unload it and move to Europe. We don't want the hassle of listing it. He paused again. No Tony, no inspections. You buy it as is. You wire the money to the offshore account I text you. I give you the keys today. You can bulldoze it tomorrow for all I care. Just get me the money. He hung up the phone and looked at Jasmine with a triumphant grin. Done, he said. Tony is interested. He is coming over now with a cashier's check for the deposit. We are going to be rich, Jasmine. We take the $2 million we pay off the syndicate, and we still have $1.5 million to play with. We are free. Jasmine wiped her eyes and smiled. It was a grotesque, greedy smile. $2 million, she said. Okay, let's sell it. Let's get rid of this dusty old museum. I looked at Jasper. He was no longer crying. He was smiling, but it was the smile of a wolf watching a lamb walk into a trap. They are selling a house they don't own, Jasper said softly. That is fraud. That is grand larceny. That is 20 years in federal prison. He looked at me. Call Mercer, Jasper commanded. Tell him to get the police ready. But not yet. Let them sign the papers. Let them take the deposit. Let them commit the crime fully. I want them in handcuffs before the ink is dry. I picked up my phone. My hand was steady. My heart was cold. I watched on the screen as Blake and Jasmine hugged each other, celebrating their victory in the middle of the room they had just trashed. They thought they had won the lottery. They didn't know they had just signed their own death warrants. They were celebrating the sale of a house that belonged to a ghost, and the ghost was coming to collect the rent. My phone buzzed on the dashboard of the truck as I drove back from the estate. It was Jasmine. Meet us at Le Jardin at 8 o'clock, she said. We need to sign some papers for the memorial service. Don't be late. And Dad, try to look presentable for once. Le Jardin was the most exclusive restaurant in the city, the kind of place where a bottle of water cost more than my weekly grocery bill. It was a place for the elite, for the power players, for people who wanted to be seen spending money. It was the last place a grieving daughter would choose to discuss a funeral, unless the funeral was just a cover for something else. I pulled into the valet circle in my rusted Ford F-150. The truck was covered in mud from the lake road, and the exhaust pipe rattled with a defiant cough as I killed the engine. It sat there like a dirty stain amidst a sea of gleaming Porsches and Bentleys. The valet, a young man in a crisp white uniform, looked at my truck with open disgust. He didn't even open my door. He just stood there tapping his foot on the pavement, waiting for me to leave. I stepped out wearing my oldest flannel shirt, the one with the fraying collar, and a pair of work boots that were stained with oil and red clay. I hadn't shaved in 2 days. I looked exactly like what they thought I was, a broken old man who had given up on life. Sir, the valet sneered, stepping in front of me. Deliveries are in the back alley. The kitchen entrance is around the corner. I am not a delivery driver. Son, I said, my voice low and raspy. I am here for dinner. The valet laughed, a short barking sound. Not dressed like that, you aren't. This is a 5-star establishment. We have a dress code. No work boots, no flannel, and definitely no mud. You need to move this heap before I call the tow truck. I saw movement near the glass doors of the entrance. Jasmine pushed them open and stepped out. She was wearing a black cocktail dress that probably cost $3,000 in diamonds that I knew belonged to my mother. She looked stunning and completely out of place next to her father. "Stop it," she commanded, her voice loud enough to turn heads in the valet line. "It is fine. Let him in." She walked over to me, her heels clicking on the pavement. She didn't hug me. She didn't even look me in the eye. She turned to the valet and the gathering crowd of onlookers with a look of long-suffering patience. "I am so sorry," Jasmine said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "This is my father. He is having a hard time. He doesn't get out much from his cabin. He doesn't really understand how these things work anymore. Please just let him in. I will make sure he doesn't disturb anyone." The valet stepped back, giving me a look of pure pity. "I understand, ma'am. You are a saint for taking care of him." Jasmine grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my bicep. "Come on, Dad," she hissed under her breath. "Try not to embarrass me more than you already have. You smell like old bait and gasoline." I let her drag me through the opulent dining room. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and truffle oil. Crystal chandeliers glittered overhead. I felt the eyes of the diners on me. They stopped their conversations to stare at the old black man in the dirty boots being led like a naughty child by the elegant woman. I saw their sneers. I saw them whisper behind their hands. I kept my head down, playing the part, letting my shoulders slump, letting them see a defeated man. Inside, I was memorizing every face. I was cataloging every insult. Jasmine wanted to humiliate me. She wanted to break my spirit so I would sign whatever she put in front of me. She didn't know that shame burns off quickly when you have walked through fire, but rage burns forever. We arrived at a large round table in the center of the room. It was the best table in the house, reserved for VIPs. Blake was holding court surrounded by 6 other people. I recognized a few of them. There were 2 local real estate developers known for shady deals, and a couple of socialites who spent their husbands' money on charity galas they only attended for the photos. Blake looked up as we approached. He was already drunk, his face was flushed, and his tie was loosened. He had a glass of scotch in one hand and a cigar in the other, ignoring the no-smoking rule because men like Blake thought rules were for other people. "Well, look who it is," Blake announced, his voice booming across the restaurant. "The prodigal father-in-law returns. Everyone clear a space. Try not to breathe through your nose, though the man brings the swamp with him." The table erupted in laughter. It was a cruel, jagged sound. "Sit down, Rufus," Blake commanded, pointing to a chair that had been pulled slightly away from the rest of the group, isolating me. I sat. The chair was velvet soft and expensive, but I felt like I was sitting on a bed of nails. A waiter approached, hesitating as he looked at my clothes. "Water," I said softly. "Just water." "Get him the tap water," Blake shouted. "Don't waste the sparkling on him. He wouldn't know the difference." Blake turned to his friends, gesturing at me with his cigar. "This is Rufus, folks, my wife's father. A real American tragedy. He used to be an engineer in the army. Can you believe that? Now look at him. Lives in a shack by the lake. Survives on a $500 allowance I give him every month out of the kindness of my heart." One of the developers, a man with a gold watch that looked heavy enough to sink a boat, leaned forward. $500. That is generous of you, Blake. Most people would put him in a state home. "I know, right," Blake said, swirling his scotch. "But Jasmine has a soft spot for strays. We tried to get him to sell that land, move into the city, but you know how they are. They cling to their dirt. They don't understand value. They don't understand progress." The racism was subtle, wrapped in a veneer of classism, but it was there, sharp as a razor. He wasn't just calling me poor, he was calling me primitive. He was reducing my entire existence to a stereotype. "You know," Blake continued, leaning back and putting his arm around Jasmine, who had sat down next to him, "it is hard. It is a burden on a young couple. We are trying to build a legacy here, trying to move up in the world, and we have this anchor dragging us down. But hey, family is family, right? Even the broken parts." He looked at me, his eyes dead and cold. "To family," Blake toasted, raising his glass. "And to the future, where dead weight finally gets cut loose." The table raised their glasses. They drank to my erasure. They drank to my irrelevance. I gripped my glass of tap water, my hand trembling slightly, not from age, but from the effort it took not to smash the glass into Blake's smiling face. I looked at Jasmine. She wasn't laughing. She was looking at her watch. She was nervous. She knew the clock was ticking on their debt. She needed this dinner to end. She needed the signature. I took a sip of water. It tasted like metal. I set the glass down and looked at Blake. "You said we needed to talk about the memorial?" I said, my voice quiet, cutting through their laughter. Blake rolled his eyes. "Always to the point, huh, Rufus? Fine, let's talk business." He snapped his fingers and Jasmine reached into her designer bag. She pulled out a thick document bound in a blue legal folder. She slid it across the white tablecloth, pushing it past the untouched bread basket until it rested in front of me. "We need to handle Grandpa's estate," Jasmine said, her voice tight. "Since you are his son, technically, you have some rights. But we all know you aren't in a position to manage anything. You can barely manage to dress yourself, Dad." I looked down at the document. The title page read, "Affidavit of Voluntary Relinquishment and Power of Attorney." "What is this?" I asked, feigning confusion, my hands shaking as I turned the page. "It is a formality," Blake said, waving his hand dismissively. "It just says that due to your advanced age and your diminished capacity, you are voluntarily transferring your rights to the estate to Jasmine. It makes her the executor. It gives her control over the assets so she can pay the bills, handle the taxes, the complicated stuff. It also says I declare myself incompetent," I whispered, reading the legal jargon in the second paragraph. "It is just language, Dad," Jasmine said, leaning in, her perfume cloying and sweet. "It is what the courts require to speed things up. If we don't do this, the estate gets frozen in probate for years. The lawyers will take everything. You don't want that, do you? You want us to be taken care of. And there is a bonus," Blake added. "If you sign this tonight, right now, we will double your allowance. $1,000 a month, Rufus. Think about it. You could buy a new truck. You could buy some actual clothes. You could live like a king in that swamp of yours." He pulled a gold fountain pen from his jacket pocket. He uncapped it and held it out to me. The light caught the gold nib. It looked like a weapon. "Sign it, Rufus," Blake said, his voice dropping to a command. "Do it for your daughter. Do it so we can stop pretending we want to have dinner with you." I looked at the pen. I looked at the paper. This was it. This was the moment they thought they won. They thought they were tricking a senile old man into signing away $8 million for $1,000 a month. I reached out and took the pen. I let my hand tremble violently. I hunched my shoulders, making myself look smaller, weaker. "Okay," I said, my voice cracking. "I trust you, Jasmine. You are a good girl. I just want to help." "Good," Blake said, exhaling a breath he had been holding. "Sign on the last page." I flipped to the signature line. I pressed the pen to the paper. But I didn't write Rufus King. I didn't write the name of the man who had served his country, who had raised a family, who had built a life. I wrote one word: Judas. I wrote it in a shaky, scrawled script that looked enough like a signature to pass a cursory glance, but was clear enough to anyone who actually read it. Judas, the betrayer, because that is what they were, and that is what this document was, a betrayal. I capped the pen and handed it back to Blake. "Thank you, Rufus," Blake said, snatching the document without even looking at the signature. "You finally did something right." He slid the folder to Jasmine, who quickly shoved it into her bag as if it were a stolen diamond. "Now," Blake said, turning back to his friends, "why don't you head out, Rufus? We have some celebrating to do, and frankly, you are killing the vibe." I stood up. My legs felt strong. My mind was clear. As I pushed my chair back, I reached into my pocket and palmed a small black device no bigger than a piece of chewing gum. It was a high-powered listening bug Mercer had given me. I pretended to stumble, catching myself on the edge of the table. "Careful, old man," Blake laughed. "Don't break a hip on the way out." In the confusion of my stumble, I pressed the device onto the underside of the table rim right next to Blake's knee. It stuck instantly. "I am sorry," I mumbled, straightening up. "I will go now. Enjoy your dinner." I turned and walked away. I didn't look back. I walked past the sneering valet, past the gleaming cars, and got into my truck. I sat there for a moment in the dark, breathing in the smell of old leather and oil. I pulled out my phone and put in an earpiece. I tuned it to the frequency of the bug. The audio was crystal clear. "Is he gone?" Blake's voice came through sharp and triumphant. "He is gone," Jasmine said. "I have the papers. We can go to the bank first thing tomorrow." "Good," Blake said. "God, he stinks. I thought I was going to vomit." One of the friends laughed. "You are cold, Blake. That is your wife's dad. He is a useless eater," Blake said, his voice dropping to a growl. "He is a waste of space." But he just signed over the keys to the kingdom. "Tony is wiring the deposit for the house tomorrow. We are going to be rich boys, filthy rich, and the best part, the old man thinks he is getting $1,000 a month. Once the cash hits our account, I am cutting him off completely. Let him starve in the woods." I started the truck. The engine roared. I wasn't just listening to their greed anymore. I was listening to their confession. And tomorrow, I was going to make sure the whole world heard it too. The morning sun had barely crested the skyline when Blake began spending money he did not have on things he did not need. I sat in my truck across the street from the luxury marina, watching through binoculars as my son-in-law signed his life away. He was standing on the dock next to a 40-foot yacht gleaming white against the dark water. The salesman was laughing at something Blake said, but the laugh was hollow, the kind reserved for fools with open checkbooks. Blake wore a linen suit that cost more than my truck. He looked like he owned the world. He didn't know he was standing on a trapdoor. I watched him pull a gold pen from his pocket, the same pen he had used to force me to sign the affidavit the night before. He flourished it in the air before pressing it to the contract. He wasn't buying the boat outright. He was putting down a non-refundable deposit of $20,000 using a high-interest credit line he had opened that morning based on his expected inheritance. I adjusted the focus on my binoculars. I could see the sweat on his forehead despite the cool breeze coming off the water. He was terrified. He was manic. He was trying to outrun his fear by burying it under layers of fiberglass and leather. After he signed the papers for the boat, he didn't stop. He got into his leased SUV and drove straight to the exotic car dealership downtown. I followed him, keeping a safe distance. I watched him walk into the showroom where a red Ferrari sat on a rotating platform. He didn't even look at the engine. He didn't ask about the mileage. He just pointed at it like a child in a candy store. I listened through the bug I had planted under the table the night before. His voice was loud and bragging. "I will take it," he told the dealer. "Wrap it up. I have a wire transfer coming in from my grandfather estate tomorrow. $8 million liquid. I need this car ready for pickup by Friday." The dealer hesitated. "Sir, we usually require a credit check and a substantial down payment before we can reserve a vehicle of this caliber." "Check my credit," Blake snapped. "It is spotless. And put the down payment on this card." He slapped a credit card on the glass desk. It was a card he had maxed out 2 days ago, but he had called the bank this morning screaming about the inheritance until they granted him a temporary increase. He was leveraging a lie to buy a fantasy. He signed a promissory note agreeing to an interest rate that would make a loan shark blush. He was so confident that the money was coming that he didn't even read the fine print. The fine print said that in the event of default, the dealership could seize not just the car, but any other assets in his name. He walked out of that dealership swinging the keys to a loaner Porsche they had given him to keep him happy. He looked invincible. He looked like a man who had won the lottery. But I knew the truth. He hadn't won anything. He had just tied a cement block to his ankles and jumped into the ocean. While Blake was busy digging his own grave with a gold shovel, Jasper was busy buying the cemetery. We met Mercer at a nondescript office building in the industrial district. It was the kind of place that didn't have a sign on the door. The windows were tinted dark and the air conditioning hummed with a low, menacing vibration. Inside, a man named Russo sat behind a metal desk. He was thick-set with scars on his knuckles and eyes that looked like they had seen everything and felt nothing. He was the man Blake owed $500,000 to. He was the man who broke legs for a living. Mercer placed a briefcase on the desk. He opened it. Inside were stacks of certified cashier checks. $500,000. The exact amount of the principal Blake owed. Russo looked at the money. He looked at Mercer. Then he looked at Jasper, who was sitting quietly in the corner, his hands resting on his cane. "You are paying off the kid debt," Russo asked, his voice gravelly. "You are a generous family member. I am not paying it off," Jasper said, his voice cutting through the room like a cold wind. "I am buying it." Russo paused, his hand hovering over the money. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I want the paper," Jasper said. "I want the promissory note. I want the lien on his house. I want the right to collect. You take this money and you walk away. Blake owes you nothing anymore. He owes me." Russo laughed a short, sharp bark. "You want to be his shark. I like your style, old man." Russo signed the transfer documents. He handed over the original loan agreement Blake had signed 6 months ago. It was a nasty piece of work. It gave the lender the right to seize all property without a court order if payment was missed by even 24 hours. It was a death sentence disguised as a loan. Jasper took the document. He held it in his hands, feeling the weight of the paper. He ran his thumb over Blake's signature. "He thinks he is free," Jasper whispered. "He thinks he can pay this off with my money, but now he has to pay me. And I don't accept cash. I only accept justice." Mercer filed the transfer immediately with the county clerk. It was official. The shadow creditor had changed. Blake didn't owe a criminal organization anymore. He owed the Jasper King Trust. He owed the very man he had declared dead. We left the office and the sun seemed a little brighter. We had the noose around his neck. Now we just had to wait for him to kick the chair away. Jasper looked at the document one last time before handing it to Mercer for safekeeping. "He called me a useless eater," Jasper said quietly. "He told you to live in a box. When I am done with him, he will wish he had a box to live in." I drove Jasper back to the cabin, but I didn't stay long. I had one more message to deliver. Phase 1 was complete. Blake was overextended and vulnerable. Now it was time to crack Jasmine. I parked my truck in the lot of a busy grocery store using the public Wi-Fi to mask my location. I pulled out a burner phone I had bought with cash at a gas station 3 towns over. I sat there for a moment thinking about my daughter. I thought about the little girl who used to run into my arms when I came home from work. I thought about the teenager who had drifted away. And I thought about the woman who had looked me in the eye and lied about her grandfather's death. She had chosen her side. She had chosen Blake and his greed over her own blood. She deserved what was coming. I typed the message carefully. I wanted it to be precise. I wanted it to be terrifying. "I know what you did last night. Dr. Miller talks in his sleep. I know the death certificate is a fake. The old man is not dead. $100,000 in crypto by midnight, or I send the audio recording to the district attorney." I attached a grainy photo I had taken of her entering Miller's clinic early that morning, a photo she didn't know existed. I hit send. Then I switched to the tracking app I had installed on her phone months ago under the guise of a family safety plan. I watched her dot on the map. She was at a high-end day spa, probably spending money on a facial to celebrate her victory. The dot stopped moving. I could imagine the scene perfectly. Her phone buzzing on the side table, her reaching for it annoyed at the interruption, her eyes scanning the message, the blood draining from her face, the panic rising in her throat like bile. 10 seconds later, the dot began to move. It moved fast. She was running. She was leaving the spa. She was driving erratically. I waited. My burner phone buzzed. It was a reply. "Who is this? You are lying." I didn't reply immediately. I let her sweat. I let her imagination do the work. She knew Miller was dirty. She knew it was possible he had talked. She knew that if this got out, she wasn't just losing the money, she was going to prison for fraud and forgery. I typed one more message. "Tick-tock Jasmine. File number 7789B. I know everything." I turned off the phone and removed the battery. I threw the SIM card into a sewer grate. The seed was planted. Jasmine was no longer a co-conspirator. She was a liability. She would panic. She would try to find the money. She would wonder if Blake knew. She would wonder if Blake had set her up. Paranoia is a powerful weapon. It eats relationships from the inside out. And tonight it was going to feast on the marriage of Jasmine and Blake. They thought they were a team. But a team requires trust, and I had just destroyed the only thing holding them together. I drove back to the lake house, the sun setting over the water, turning the surface to liquid gold. Jasper was sitting on the porch, rocking slowly. "Did you send it?" he asked without looking up. "It is done," I said, sitting on the step beside him. "She is running scared." "Good," Jasper said. "Tonight they will turn on each other. Tonight they will realize that the money they haven't even touched yet is already cursed." We sat in silence watching the day end. We were 2 old men in a cabin the world had forgotten. But we held the strings to a tragedy that was just beginning, and we were about to pull them tight. I sat in the darkness of my truck parked 3 blocks away from the luxury condo my daughter and son-in-law called home. The engine was off, but the surveillance equipment was running hot. I adjusted the volume on the receiver. The bug I had planted under the table at the restaurant was recording perfectly, but I had also tapped into the baby monitor frequency they still used for their security system inside the house. I wasn't just an eavesdropper anymore. I was a witness to the disintegration of a marriage built on greed. Through the static, I heard the distinct sound of paper being slammed onto a marble countertop. It was Jasmine. Her voice was trembling not with sorrow, but with the frantic energy of a cornered animal. "Blake, look at this statement," she hissed. "There is a withdrawal here. $50,000. It was taken out this morning from our joint emergency fund. That was the last of the liquid cash we had. Where is it?" I leaned in closer to the speaker. I knew exactly where it was. Blake had used it to pay the deposit on the Ferrari and the boat. He had spent money he didn't have to buy toys he would never own. There was a pause. I could hear the clink of glass on glass. Blake was pouring another drink. "It is an investment, Jasmine," he said, his voice slurring slightly with arrogance. "I moved it to a crypto wallet. The market is about to spike. By the time the estate clears, I will have doubled it. You should be thanking me." "Thanking you!" Jasmine screamed. Her voice cracked. "We are being blackmailed, Blake. I got a text message. Someone knows about Dr. Miller. Someone knows the death certificate is fake. They want $100,000 by midnight or they go to the district attorney." I smiled in the darkness. My message had found its mark. "You are being paranoid," Blake scoffed. "Nobody knows. Miller is solid. I paid him enough to keep his mouth shut until the end of time. You are probably just seeing spam messages. Stop acting like a hysterical woman." "I am not hysterical," Jasmine yelled. "The money is gone, Blake. If this blackmailer is real, we have nothing to pay him with. And if the lenders find out we are empty before the inheritance comes through, they will kill us. You promised me you would handle the finances. You said we were safe until Friday." Blake laughed, a cruel, dismissive sound that made my blood boil. "I am handling it," he said. "You are the one who is losing it. Look at you. You are a mess. You can't even handle your own father. I had to force you to get that signature last night. If you had done your job years ago and got the old man to sign the power of attorney, we wouldn't be in this mess. This is your fault, Jasmine. You are too soft. You are weak, just like your father." He was gaslighting her. He was taking his own theft, his own incompetence, and twisting it until it was her burden to bear. He had stolen her safety net, and now he was blaming her for falling. "I am not weak," Jasmine sobbed. "I forged the signature on the bank affidavit. I lied to the police. I am doing everything, Blake." "You are doing what you are told." Blake snapped. "Now shut up about the money. The 50 grand is safe. Focus on the big picture. $8 million, Jasmine. Once that wire hits, we can pay off everyone. We can pay the blackmailer. We can pay the sharks. Just keep your mouth shut and let me drive." He was lying to her and she knew it, but she was too terrified to fight back. She was trapped in a cage of her own making, and Blake held the only key. I listened as the argument died down into sullen silence. They were leaving the condo. I saw the garage door open down the street. Their black SUV pulled out. I started my truck and followed them, keeping my lights off until I was on the main road. The crack in their foundation had formed. Now I was going to watch it shatter. I followed them onto the highway. They were heading north toward the industrial district where the shadier funeral homes operated. I switched my receiver to the bug I had planted in their car. The audio quality was pristine. The interior of a luxury car is quiet, designed to keep the world out, but it also keeps the secrets in. Jasmine was crying softly. It was a pathetic sound. "Stop sniveling," Blake said. "It is pathetic." "I am scared, Blake," she whispered. "What if the blackmailer is real? What if they go to the cops? We will go to prison." "I can't go to prison. I am a mother." "You are barely a mother," Blake sneered. "The nanny raises those kids. And stop worrying. I will handle it. I always handle it." "You didn't handle the bank," Jasmine said, her voice gaining a tiny spark of courage. "You said it would be easy. You said we would walk in and walk out with the bonds, but we got kicked out, and now the money is gone. And you bought a boat, Blake." "I saw the email confirmation. You bought a boat when we are being extorted." Blake slammed his hand on the steering wheel. The sound was like a gunshot in the cabin. "I bought the boat because I deserve it," he shouted. "I have put up with your family for 10 years, Jasmine. 10 years of smiling at your senile grandfather. 10 years of pretending to respect your loser father. Do you know how hard that is? Do you know how embarrassing it is to tell my friends that my father-in-law lives in a shack?" It hurt to hear him say it. It hurt because for years I had tried to be kind to him. I had welcomed him. I had ignored his subtle digs and his backhanded compliments. I thought he was just awkward. I didn't know he was full of hate. My father is a good man. Jasmine defended weakly. Your father is a joke, Blake spat. And your grandfather is a dinosaur. I earned this money, Jasmine. I earned it by putting up with them. And I earned it by putting up with you. The car went silent. The air was thick with unsaid words. What does that mean? Jasmine asked, her voice barely a whisper. It means, Blake said, his voice dropping to a cold, venomous register, that I only married you for the payout. Did you really think I loved you? Look in the mirror, Jasmine. You are nothing special. You are just the granddaughter of a rich old man. I gripped the steering wheel of my truck until my knuckles popped. You don't mean that, Jasmine said. I mean every word, Blake said. I married you because I did the math. I saw the estate. I saw the age of the old man. I figured 5 years tops. But he just kept living. He kept breathing. And I had to keep waking up next to you. He laughed, and it was the ugliest sound I had ever heard. And let us be honest, Jasmine, he continued. Did you really think a guy like me would settle for a woman like you without a price tag attached? You should be grateful. I elevated you. I gave you status. Without me, you are just another black girl from the South with a famous last name and no class. There it was, the racism. It wasn't subtle anymore. It wasn't hidden behind jokes or politics. It was naked and ugly. He had called her stupid. He had called her inferior. He had reduced my daughter, the child I had raised with pride and history, to nothing more than a racial stereotype and a bank account. I expected Jasmine to scream. I expected her to slap him. I expected her to demand he stop the car. But there was only silence. Jasmine sat there and took it. She swallowed the insult. She absorbed the hate because she was too deep in the crime to leave him. She needed him to finish the job. She needed him to get the money. She sold her dignity for $8 million. I am sorry, she whispered finally. I am sorry I annoyed you. Just please fix this. I turned off the volume for a second. I needed to breathe. My daughter was gone. The woman in that car was a stranger. She had let a man dehumanize her, and she had apologized for it. There was no saving her now. There was only justice. I turned the volume back on. I needed to hear the rest. I needed to know how low they would go. The car slowed down. They were pulling into the parking lot of a secluded area near the river. It wasn't the funeral home. It was a place where people went to hide. We need to change the plan. Blake said, his voice calm again now that he had broken her spirit. The stroke story is too weak. If there is a blackmailer, they know Miller is a quack. A stroke leaves a body. A body can be autopsied. If they exhume him and find out he didn't have a heart attack, we are done. What do we do? Jasmine asked, her voice hollow. We need a closed casket, Blake said. A permanently closed casket. And we need a cause of death that explains why there is no body to look at. He paused, letting the idea hang in the air. We changed the narrative, he said. It wasn't a stroke. It was a car accident. A fiery crash. He lost control of his vintage car. It went off the road. It burned. The body is unrecognizable. But the death certificate, Jasmine stammered. We already filed it. We file an amendment, Blake said. Miller will do it for another $5,000. We say there was a clerical error. Or better yet, we stage the crash tonight. We take his old Cadillac, the one he keeps in the Atlanta garage. We drive it into a ravine. We torch it. We say he died in the crash, not in his sleep. Why? Jasmine asked. Because accidental death pays double, Blake said. His life insurance policy has a double indemnity clause. If he dies in an accident, the payout goes from $2 million to $4 million. That gives us enough cash to pay everyone and buy an island. Double indemnity. They weren't satisfied with stealing the estate. They wanted to defraud the insurance company too. And to do it, they were going to desecrate my father's memory even further. They were going to stage a violent death. They were going to burn a car that my father had restored with his own hands. And it solves the body problem, Blake added. If the car burns hot enough, there is nothing left but teeth. We put some ashes in a box, bury it, and no one can ever prove he didn't die in that fire. It is perfect, Jasmine. It cleans up everything. We need to do it tonight, Jasmine said, her voice gaining strength. If we do it tonight, we can file the claim tomorrow. Exactly, Blake said. We go to the Atlanta house. We get the car. We drive it to the quarry. I have gasoline in the trunk. I listened in horror. They were escalating. They were moving from paper crimes to physical destruction. They were going to stage a scene of horror to cover their tracks. I grabbed my phone and dialed Mercer. They are changing the script, I told him, my voice steady. They are planning to stage a car accident. They are going to torch my father's Cadillac. Let them, Mercer said. Let them drive that car out of the garage. I will have a drone in the air. We will film the whole thing. But the car, I said. It is just metal, Rufus, Mercer said gently. Let them burn it. The fire will be the beacon that leads them to prison. I hung up. I watched their SUV pull out of the lot. They were heading to my father's house to steal his car and fake his violent death. I put my truck in gear. I wasn't just following them anymore. I was escorting them to their doom. The funeral home was tucked away in a strip mall between a bail bond office and a discount tire shop. It was called the Final Rest, but it looked more like a place where evidence went to disappear. The neon sign in the window flickered with a dying buzz, and the air inside smelled of stale lilies and industrial strength cleaner trying to mask something sweeter and more rotten. I stood outside in the rain, my collar turned up against the wind, watching through the tinted glass as my son-in-law negotiated the cost of disposing of my father. I adjusted the frequency on my earpiece. I had paid the janitor $50 to leave a window cracked in the viewing room so the bug I placed on the sill could pick up the conversation. The audio was tinny, but clear enough to hear the sound of Blake's greed. I don't care about the lining, Blake said, his voice echoing in the empty room. He is dead. He does not need satin. He does not need velvet. He needs a box. Give me the cheapest thing you have. I mean the absolute bottom of the barrel. Particle board, cardboard, whatever is legal. I watched as the funeral director, a man named Vane with a suit that was too shiny and hands that were too soft, nodded slowly. He was used to grief, but he was also used to cheapskates. We have a basic cremation container, Vane said. It is essentially reinforced cardboard. It costs $200. But sir, for a viewing or a service, people usually prefer something with a veneer. No viewing, Blake snapped. Closed casket. Permanently closed. The accident was messy, remember? Fire damage. Fire. Trauma. Nobody wants to see that. We just need a box that looks good from 20 feet away for the church service. Do you have something that looks expensive but costs dirt? Vane tapped his pen on his ledger. I have a rental casket. It is oak with gold handles. We put the cardboard insert inside. You rent the oak shell for the service, then we remove the insert for the cremation. $500. Perfect, Blake said. We will take the rental. But here is the deal, Vane. I need an invoice. And I don't want it to say $500. Vane paused. What do you want it to say? I want it to say $50,000. Blake said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. I want it to list a solid mahogany casket with bronze fittings. I want it to list full preservation embalming. I want it to list a fleet of limousines and a police escort. I want every bell and whistle you can think of. That is fraud, Sir Vane said, but there was no moral outrage in his voice, just a negotiation tactic. That puts my license at risk. Blake laughed. It is not fraud. It is creative accounting. The estate pays for the funeral. The insurance company reimburses the estate. If the bill is $50,000, they cut a check for $50,000. You get $5,000 cash under the table for printing a piece of paper, and I get the rest. Everyone wins. And the dead guy certainly doesn't care. I felt a cold rage settle in my stomach. Blake wasn't just trying to save money. He was actively looting the funds before the body was even cold. He was turning my father's final rite of passage into a money laundering scheme. He wanted to parade a fake $50,000 funeral in front of his wealthy friends while dumping my father into a cardboard box. $5,000 is low, Vane countered. For that kind of risk, I need 10. 7, Blake said. And you keep the cardboard box. Just dump the ashes in a coffee can for all I care. We are going to bury the box anyway. Deal, Vane said. They shook hands over the deal, a handshake that sold my father's dignity for a kickback. I watched Blake smile, that shark-like grin of his. He looked like a man who had just pulled off the heist of the century. He didn't know that the heist was being recorded and that the man he was robbing was standing 10 feet away in the rain. It was time to make my entrance. I needed to escalate the conflict. I needed to force Blake to show his true cruelty in front of witnesses. I pushed open the heavy glass door. A bell chimed overhead, a cheerful sound that felt out of place in this house of death. Blake spun around. His smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sneering annoyance. Jasmine, who was sitting in a corner looking at her phone, stood up nervously. "What are you doing here, Rufus?" Blake demanded, stepping between me and the casket showroom. I told you this was private. I ignored him. I walked forward, my boots squeaking on the cheap linoleum. I looked disheveled. My eyes were red-rimmed from lack of sleep, though the sleeplessness was from planning, not grieving. I want to see him, I said, my voice cracking. I want to see my father. You said there was an accident. You said he died in the car. I need to see him, Blake. I need to say goodbye. You can't see him, Blake said, putting a hand on my chest to stop me. The casket is closed, Rufus. Closed means closed. I pushed against his hand. He is my father. I have a right. Open the box, Blake. I don't care how he looks. I have seen death before. I was in the army. I can take it. You are making a scene, Jasmine hissed, coming up beside her husband. Dad, please, go home. You are embarrassing us. Mr. Vane is a professional. You are dirtying his floor. I don't care about the floor, I shouted, letting the desperation bleed into my voice. I want to see my father. Why won't you let me see him? What are you hiding? Blake signaled to the corner of the room. A large man in a security uniform stepped out of the shadows. I recognized him. He was an off-duty bouncer from one of the clubs Blake frequented. He was hired muscle-paid to keep the rabble away from the loot. Get him out of here, Blake ordered, pointing at me. The guard grabbed my arm. His grip was like a vice. He spun me around, twisting my arm behind my back. Pain shot through my shoulder, but I didn't fight back. I needed this. I needed the physical assault on record. You are hurting me, I yelled for the benefit of the hidden camera I wore on my lapel. I am an old man. Let me go. Throw him in the street, Blake sneered. As the guard dragged me toward the door, Blake leaned in close. His face was inches from mine. I could smell the mints he used to cover the alcohol. He wanted to twist the knife one last time. He wanted to make sure I knew my place. He is rotting, Rufus, Blake whispered into my ear, his voice full of venom. He is meat in a box. He is burned and broken, and he smells like cooked pork. Do you really want to see that? Do you want that to be your last memory? He is garbage now, just like you. So do us all a favor and vanish. The guard shoved me through the door. I stumbled onto the wet pavement, landing on my hands and knees in a puddle. The door slammed shut behind me and the lock clicked. I stayed there for a moment on the ground, letting the rain soak my flannel shirt. I looked like the picture of defeat. A broken son thrown out of his father's funeral. A man denied his final goodbye. Passers-by looked at me with pity and hurried on. But inside I was smiling, because I knew something Blake didn't. I knew the secret of the box. I knew that there was no body in that rental casket. I knew that the car accident had been staged perfectly with the drone footage Mercer had captured, but the car had been empty when it went over the cliff. My father wasn't burned. He wasn't broken. He was sitting in the cabin, probably eating a sandwich and watching the game. But Blake needed a body for the funeral. He needed weight in the casket so the pallbearers wouldn't get suspicious. He needed it to feel real. So yesterday, before Blake and Jasmine had even arrived at the funeral home, I had paid a visit to Mr. Vane's assistant, a young man who hated his boss and needed money for tuition. For $500, he had agreed to follow my instructions. There was no body in the back room. There were no remains waiting to be cremated. The box that Blake was paying $7,000 to rent, the box that he was charging $50,000 to the estate for, was filled with 80 pounds of play sand and broken bricks from a construction site. I stood up, slowly wiping the mud from my hands. I looked at the security camera mounted above the door of the funeral home. I knew it was recording. I turned toward it and let my face crumple into a mask of absolute despair. I acted the part of the grieving, traumatized son perfectly. They wouldn't let me see him. I sobbed loud enough for any witnesses to hear. They threw me out. My own family. I walked away into the rain, my shoulders hunched. I had the audio of the fraud. I had the footage of the assault. And I had the knowledge that tomorrow at the church, in front of all of Blake's high society friends and creditors, they were going to hold a solemn funeral for a pile of construction waste. Blake thought he was burying a secret. He thought he was burying the evidence of his crime. He didn't know he was carrying a Trojan horse into the sanctuary. He didn't know that when that casket opened and it would open, the sand would run out and his life would run out with it. I got back into my truck and pulled out a handkerchief to dry my face. The performance was over. The trap was primed. Tomorrow was the main event. Tomorrow the dead would not rise, but the truth would, and it would bring the roof down on their heads. I started the engine and drove toward the lake, leaving the funeral home and its lies behind in the dark. I stood in the suffocating darkness of the narrow utility closet, my back pressed against the rough cedar planks and my breath held tight in my chest. Through the thin slats of the louvered door, I watched the sanctuary of my life be violated. It was 2 in the morning. My daughter Jasmine had arrived just as I predicted she would. Paranoia was a hungry beast, and it was eating her alive. She was convinced that the bank error was a lie. She was convinced I was hoarding a secret key or a hidden deed that would unlock the millions she so desperately needed. She had broken the lock on the front door of my rental apartment with a brick, not caring about the noise, not caring about the damage. She stomped into the small living room wearing dark clothes and gloves like a thief in a bad movie. She did not look for money in the usual places. She did not look in the cookie jar or under the mattress. She went straight for the places that held memories. She tore the books off the shelves, shaking them violently, hoping a document would fall out. When nothing fell, she threw the books against the wall. I saw her face in the moonlight filtering through the window. It was twisted into a mask of pure, ugly desperation. Her eyes were wide and manic. She was muttering to herself, cursing me, cursing Blake, cursing the grandfather she thought was dead. "Where is it?" she hissed, kicking over my small coffee table. "Where is the real will, you old fool? I know you have it. I know Grandpa gave it to you." She moved into the kitchenette. She opened the cabinets and swept the few dishes I owned onto the floor. The sound of ceramic shattering was loud and violent, but she didn't flinch. She was looking for a false bottom. She was looking for a taped envelope. She ripped the drawers out of their tracks, dumping silverware and napkins onto the linoleum. She was destroying the only home I had left, the humble space I had retreated to so I wouldn't be a burden. She looked at my simple life, my clean but worn furniture, and she hated it. She hated it because it represented everything she was terrified of becoming. She tore the cushions off the sofa and used a knife from her pocket to slice them open, plunging her hand into the stuffing, searching for gold in a place that held only dust. I watched her move to the bedroom. I had to shift my position to see through the crack in the hinges. My legs were cramping, but I did not move. I held my phone up the camera lens, pressed to the gap, recording every second of her rampage. She was not just a thief tonight, she was a storm. She pulled the sheets off my bed and overturned the mattress. She was panting now, sweat glistening on her forehead. She was running out of time, and she was running out of places to look. She fell to her knees and dragged a cardboard box out from under the bed frame. It was an old shoebox, taped shut and labeled simply Viola. My heart hammered against my ribs. That box did not contain money. It did not contain deeds or stock certificates. It contained the only things in this world that truly mattered to me. It contained the love letters my mother Viola had written to my father when he was working across the country to build his business. It contained the photographs of my childhood, and it contained the Silver Star medal I had earned in Vietnam, a piece of metal that represented the blood I had spilled for a country that didn't always love me back. Jasmine ripped the tape off the box. She dumped the contents onto the floor. Old yellowed paper fluttered down like dead leaves. She picked up a stack of letters tied with a blue ribbon. She frantically flipped through them, looking for cash hidden between the pages. When she found nothing, she screamed. It was a guttural, animalistic sound of frustration. "Trash," she screamed. "It is all just trash." She looked at the handwriting on the envelopes. She saw her grandmother's elegant script. She knew what they were, and she didn't care. In fact, she seemed to hate them even more because they were sentimental. She ripped the ribbon off. She took a handful of the letters that spoke of struggle and hope and enduring love, and she tore them in half. Then she tore them again. She threw the confetti of my history into the air. "Look at this," she spat, her voice dripping with venom. "Love letters. Pathetic. This is why you are poor, Dad. This is why you live in a hole. You hold on to feelings instead of assets. You hold on to garbage." She dug through the pile on the floor and found the small velvet case. She popped it open. The metal sat there gleaming dully in the shadows. For a second I thought she might hesitate. I thought she might remember the stories I told her about the war, about the men I saved, about the cost of freedom. But Jasmine was no longer my daughter. She was Blake's creature now. She was a creature of appetite. She looked at the metal with disgust. "It isn't even gold," she muttered. "It is cheap. Just like you. Just like this whole family." She threw the metal onto the floor. And then in a moment that severed the last thread of connection between us, she stomped on it. She ground her expensive designer boot heel into the symbol of my sacrifice. She twisted her foot, trying to break the clasp, trying to crush the metal. "I hate this," she yelled at the empty room. "I hate coming from this. I hate that my blood is tied to this weakness." Blake was right. You people are anchors. You drag everyone down with your stories and your history and your poverty. I deserve better than this. I deserve to be free of you." She wasn't just rejecting me. She was rejecting her race. She was rejecting the struggle of the generations before her. She was spitting on the grave of the grandmother who had braided her hair. She was cursing the skin she lived in because she had convinced herself that whiteness and wealth were the only things that made a person human. She kicked the pile of torn letters, scattering them across the room. "Die already," she whispered, her voice trembling with rage. "Just die so I can be free. Why do you have to be so stubborn? Why do you have to exist?" She kicked the empty box across the room. It hit the closet door right in front of my face. I flinched, but I kept the camera steady. I needed this. I needed the jury to see the hate in her eyes. I needed the world to see that this wasn't about money anymore. It was about erasure. She wanted to erase me. She wanted to erase her past so she could pretend she had been born a queen. I stood there in the dark watching the stranger in my living room. I felt a coldness spread through my chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was the death of fatherhood. For 35 years, I had loved her. I had forgiven her mistakes. I had made excuses for her selfishness. I had told myself she was just young, she was just influenced by the wrong people. But tonight, I saw the truth. The rot was inside her. It wasn't Blake. It was her. Blake had just watered the seed that was already there. Jasmine stood in the middle of the ruin she had created. She was breathing hard, chest heaving. She looked around one last time, scanning the debris for anything shiny, anything valuable. Finding nothing, she let out a scream of pure frustration, a sound that echoed off the peeling paint of the walls. "Useless," she screamed. "You are useless to me." She turned and marched toward the door. She stepped on the torn remains of my mother's letters without looking down. She kicked the door open and stormed out into the night, leaving the door hanging off its hinges, leaving my life scattered on the floor, leaving me in the silence of the aftermath. I waited until I heard her car engine start. I waited until the sound of her tires on the gravel faded into the distance. Only then did I reach for the handle of the closet door. My hand was shaking not from fear, but from the adrenaline of absolute finality. I pushed the door open and stepped out into the room. The air smelled of her expensive perfume and the dust she had kicked up. I looked at the floor. The sight of my mother's handwriting torn into shreds broke something inside me that could never be fixed. I knelt down. I picked up the metal. The pin was bent. The ribbon was dirty, but the metal was still intact. It was strong, like me. I gathered the pieces of the letters. I couldn't read them anymore, but I held them to my chest. I felt the tears coming hot and fast. I let them fall. I cried for the little girl with ribbons in her hair who used to hold my hand. I cried for the woman who had just stomped on my heart. I cried because I knew what I had to do next. I stood up. I wiped my face. I looked at the phone in my hand. The video file was saved. It was 5 minutes of pure, unadulterated malice. It was the evidence that would strip her of everything. It was the nail in her coffin. I dialed Mercer's number. It was 3 a.m, but I knew he would answer. He picked up on the first ring. Rufus Mercer said, his voice alert. "Are you okay?" I looked at the destruction around me. "No, Mercer." I said, my voice flat and dead. "I am not okay. She was here. She destroyed Viola's letters. She stomped on my metal. She said she hated her blood." There was a silence on the line, a respectful, angry silence. "Do you have it?" Mercer asked. "Did you record it?" "I have it," I said. "I have all of it," good Mercer said. "Bring it to me." "No," I said. "Not yet." I walked over to the window and looked out at the dark trees. "Mercer, activate the final phase I commanded. No mercy, no deals. I want them buried. I want them to lose the house, the cars, the clothes on their backs. I want them to rot." "Understood," Mercer said. "We are ready. The funeral is tomorrow. That is where we end this." I hung up the phone. I looked around the apartment one last time. I wouldn't clean it up. I would leave it exactly like this. I wanted the police to see it. I wanted the judge to see it. This wasn't a home anymore. It was a crime scene. And the victim wasn't just an old man. The victim was a family. I grabbed my jacket and walked out the broken door. I didn't look back. The father who had tried to save his daughter stayed in that room buried under the torn letters. The man who walked out was the soldier, and the soldier was going to war. St. Jude's Cathedral was a monument to old money and high expectations, the kind of place where God seemed to require a membership fee and a credit check before hearing your prayers. The vaulted ceiling stretched high enough to swallow the sound of 1,000 lies, and the stained glass windows turned the midday sun into a kaleidoscope of expensive light. It was the perfect stage for the final act of my daughter's con. The pews were packed, but not with friends and not with family. I stood in the shadows of the choir loft looking down at the sea of black suits and designer dresses. I recognized the faces. They were not mourners, they were marks. There were the hard money lenders from the syndicate sitting in the back row like vultures waiting for a carcass. There were the real estate brokers Blake was trying to impress. There were the investors he had defrauded with his crypto schemes, men who were promised a full repayment the moment the estate settled. Blake had turned my father's funeral into a networking event. He was selling shares in a dead man. The center of attention was the casket. It was the rental unit Blake had haggled for a magnificent polished mahogany shell with bronze rails that gleamed under the altar lights. It looked like it held a king. It looked like it held a legacy worth $8 million. Only I knew it held 80 pounds of playground sand and broken bricks from a demolition site. It was a hollow prop for a hollow man. Blake stood by the entrance, shaking hands with a solemn gravity that made my stomach turn. He dabbed at his dry eyes with a silk handkerchief, accepting condolences from men he owed money to. "Thank you for coming," he whispered to a man I knew was a loan shark. "It is a hard day, but we will have the liquidity to settle accounts by Monday." He was leveraging the funeral to buy time. He was using the solemnity of death to keep his knees from being broken. The organ music swelled a mournful tune that cost $500 an hour. The flowers were everywhere, vast arrangements of white lilies and orchids that filled the air with a cloying, suffocating scent. I knew from Mercer's investigation that Blake had charged $50,000 to the estate for these flowers, but had actually bought them wholesale from a discount supplier for $3,000. Every petal was a receipt for theft. The atmosphere was thick with the grease of commerce disguised as grief. It was a room full of people pretending to care about a man they had never met, all hoping to get a piece of the fortune he had supposedly left behind. And in the front row, sitting with her head bowed in a performance of perfect devastation, was Jasmine. She wore a black veil that hid her eyes, but I knew she wasn't crying. She was calculating. She was counting the seconds until she could sign the papers and erase us. The music faded and Jasmine stood up. She walked to the podium with a slow, measured gait. She gripped the sides of the lectern as if she needed support to stand under the weight of her sorrow. She looked out at the crowd, at the strangers and the creditors, and she began to speak. Her voice was soft trembling, just enough to sell the lie. "Grandpa Jasper was more than a grandfather to me," she said into the microphone. "He was my rock. He was my best friend." I gripped the railing of the loft. A rock. She had called him a useless eater, a best friend. She had thrown his picture against the wall and stomped on his face. She had wished him dead 1,000 times. But here in front of the audience she needed to win over, she painted a portrait of a saint. "He used to tell me stories about building this city," she continued, wiping a non-existent tear. "He told me that his only wish was for me to carry on his legacy. He told me that he was saving everything for me because he knew I was the only one who truly understood his vision. He didn't trust banks. He didn't trust lawyers. He only trusted family. It was a masterclass in manipulation. She was establishing the narrative for the fake will she planned to present. She was planting the seeds that Jasper had secretly despised everyone but her. She was rewriting history to justify her theft. And even though he didn't leave a formal will," she said, her voice gaining strength, "he made his wishes clear to me in his final moments. He wanted us to live in his house. He wanted us to use his resources to build a future. He wanted me to be happy." While she spun her web of lies, I looked at Blake. He wasn't watching his wife. He wasn't mourning. He was standing off to the side near a marble pillar partially obscured by a massive floral arrangement. He had his phone out, holding it low against his thigh. I raised my binoculars. The screen was bright in the dim church. He was texting. I focused on the text. The recipient was named Tiffany. "Almost done, baby. The old man is in this ground. The money hits the account tomorrow. Pack your bags. We are going to St. Bart's. Leave your husband. I am rich." I watched him hit send. A smirk played on his lips, a tiny crack in his mask of mourning. He was cheating on the wife he was conspiring with. He was planning to abandon her the moment he got his hands on the cash. They were a nest of vipers biting each other's tails. Jasmine was up there selling her soul to save their marriage and pay their debts, and Blake was already spending the money on a new life with a new woman. He looked up from his phone and caught the eye of the loan shark in the back row. He gave a subtle nod, a gesture that said, "Everything is under control." He thought he was the smartest man in the room. He thought he was pulling the strings. He didn't know the strings were actually nooses, and they were already tightening around his neck. Jasmine finished her eulogy with a dramatic sob collapsing slightly so that the priest had to catch her arm. It was perfect theater. The crowd murmured in sympathy. The loan sharks looked satisfied. The real estate brokers looked ready to close the deal. The deception was complete. They had sold the lie. Then the heavy oak doors at the back of the cathedral groaned. It wasn't a gentle opening. It was a violent shove. The doors slammed against the stone walls with a boom that echoed like a cannon shot. A gust of wind blew in from the street, extinguishing the candles in the back row and sending a ripple through the flowers. The murmur of the crowd died instantly. Every head turned. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright afternoon sun, was a figure that looked like judgment itself. It was Mercer. He was wearing a charcoal suit that looked like armor. He held a leather briefcase in one hand and a rolled-up document in the other. Flanking him were the county sheriff and two uniformed deputies, their hands resting on their belts, their faces grim. Blake stepped forward, his face flushing with anger. He marched down the center aisle, his footsteps loud on the marble. He looked like a man whose party had been crashed by the help. "What is this?" Blake hissed, his voice a low growl that carried in the silence. "This is a private service. Get out. You have no right to be here. Get out before I have you arrested for trespassing." He waved his hand at the security guards he had hired, but they hesitated seeing the sheriff. Blake didn't care about the law. He cared about the illusion. He cared about the investors seeing him lose control. Mercer didn't stop. He walked forward, his pace steady and relentless. He met Blake in the middle of the aisle. He towered over my son-in-law, not in height, but in presence. "I am not here for the service," Blake Mercer said, his voice booming without a microphone. "I am here for the body." The crowd gasped. A ripple of shock went through the pews. Jasmine froze at the altar, her hands clutching the podium. "You are insane," Blake shouted, losing his composure. "This is a funeral. My grandfather is in that box. You are desecrating a holy moment. Sheriff, arrest this man." The sheriff stepped forward. He didn't look at Blake. He looked at the casket. "Mr. King," the sheriff said, his voice calm and authoritative. "I have a court order signed by Judge Holloway 20 minutes ago. We have received credible evidence suggesting that a felony has been committed, specifically insurance fraud forgery and the falsification of death records." "That is a lie," Blake screamed, saliva flying from his mouth. He looked wild. He looked terrified. "Who told you that?" "It was Rufus, wasn't it? That crazy old man is lying to you. He is bitter because he got cut out of the will." Mercer raised the document in his hand. It was a search warrant. "The order authorizes us to seize all assets related to the estate of Jasper King Mercer," announced, turning to face the crowd. "And it authorizes us to open that casket immediately to verify the identity of the deceased." "No!" Jasmine shrieked from the altar. She ran down the steps, her heels slipping on the stone. "You can't open it. He was in a car accident. He is burned. It is traumatizing. You can't show that to people. It is disrespectful. It is necessary," the sheriff said, pushing past Blake. Blake tried to grab the sheriff's arm, a foolish, desperate move. The deputy behind him stepped in, grabbing Blake's wrist and twisting it, forcing him back. "Stand down, sir," the deputy warned. "Do not interfere with the police investigation." The room was in chaos. The investors were standing up, sensing that their money was evaporating. The loan sharks were moving toward the exits, realizing the con was up. But the police blocked the doors. No one was leaving. Mercer walked up to the altar. He stood next to the casket. He looked at Jasmine, who was trembling so hard her veil was shaking. "If your grandfather is in this box," Jasmine, Mercer said, his voice dropping to a whisper that only she and the front row could hear, "then you have nothing to fear. But if he isn't, then you are going to prison." Jasmine looked at the box. She looked at Blake. She knew what was inside. She knew it was sand. She knew the game was over. "Open it," the sheriff commanded. Two deputies stepped up to the gleaming mahogany casket. They undid the latches. The click of the metal echoed like a gunshot. Blake closed his eyes. Jasmine let out a whimper. The heavy lid was lifted. The audience craned their necks, expecting to see a body, expecting to see the tragedy Blake had described. Instead, they saw the truth. They saw the gray, dusty pile of construction sand. They saw the broken red bricks. They saw the empty void where a human being should have been. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. It was a sound of pure disbelief. "Where is he?" Jasmine screamed, trying to sell the lie one last time, trying to pretend she was the victim. Who stole his body? Who took my grandfather? But it was too late. The lie had been cracked open. The empty box was a mouth screaming their guilt. Blake stared at the sand, his face draining of all color. He looked at his phone still in his hand where the text to Tiffany sat on the screen. He looked at the loan shark who was now staring at him with a look that promised violence. He realized then that he wasn't just broke. He was a dead man walking. The church, which had been a stage for their triumph, had become a courtroom, and the verdict was sitting in a pile of sand at the altar. The air in the cathedral was thick enough to choke on as the sheriff stepped toward the altar, his boots clicking heavily against the marble floor. He moved with the slow, deliberate weight of the law, and every step he took tightened the noose around my daughter's neck. Jasmine stood between him and the mahogany casket, her chest heaving, her hands gripping the polished wood as if she were holding onto a life raft in a hurricane. She looked wild. The elegant facade of the grieving granddaughter had completely shattered, leaving behind a terrified woman who knew that the contents of that box, or rather the lack thereof, would be her undoing. She saw the sheriff reaching for the lid and she snapped. It was a break from reality, a desperate feral attempt to stop the inevitable. She threw her body across the casket, her arms spreading wide to cover the bronze latches. She screamed, and the sound was not human. It was the high-pitched shriek of a creature caught in a trap. "Don't touch him," she yelled, her voice cracking and echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "You have no right. Get back. This is sacrilege. Don't you dare touch my grandfather." It was a performance, but it was fueled by genuine terror. She wasn't protecting my father's dignity. She was protecting her own freedom. She knew that once that lid was lifted, the fraud would be exposed to the world. She knew that the insurance claim, the real estate deal, the loans, everything hinged on the lie inside that box. The sheriff signaled to his deputies. Two large men in uniform stepped forward, their faces grim. They didn't want to wrestle a woman at a funeral, but they had their orders. They reached for her arms. Jasmine kicked out her designer heels, scraping against the shins of the officers. She thrashed and bit spitting curses that would make a sailor blush. "Get your hands off me," she shrieked. "Blake, help me, do something. They are desecrating him." She looked at her husband, her eyes wide and pleading, begging him to intervene, begging him to use his charm or his anger or his lies to stop this. But Blake didn't move. He stood in the aisle, frozen, his face pale and slick with sweat. He watched his wife fight the police, and he did nothing. He was already calculating his own survival, and he knew that interfering with a police search warrant would only add to his sentence. He let her fight alone. The deputies grabbed Jasmine by the shoulders and hauled her back. Her fingernails scrabbled against the wood, leaving long scratches in the expensive varnish. She was sobbing now, huge, gasping breaths that tore through her chest. They dragged her away from the altar, her feet sliding on the stone floor, her black dress bunching up around her legs. She was no longer the dignified heir. She was a criminal being restrained at a crime scene. She slumped in the grip of the officers, her strength leaving her as she realized she had lost. She looked at the sheriff with eyes full of hatred and fear. "You can't do this," she whispered. "Please don't do this." The sheriff ignored her. He stood before the casket. He pulled a pair of blue latex gloves from his belt and snapped them on. The sound was sharp and final. He looked at the crowd, his expression unreadable. Then he reached out and undid the latches. Click, click, click. The sound was like a hammer striking a nail into a coffin. The entire church held its breath. The silence was absolute. The sheriff gripped the heavy mahogany lid and lifted. The hinges groaned a low, mournful sound that seemed to mourn the death of the truth. He pushed the lid all the way back until it rested open, exposing the interior to the light streaming in through the stained glass windows. I watched from the choir loft, my hands gripping the railing. I knew what was inside, but seeing it exposed to the world gave me a fierce, cold satisfaction. The crowd craned their necks, leaning forward in the pews, expecting to see a tragedy. They expected to see the charred remains of a beloved civic leader. They expected to see a body wrapped in linen. What they saw was a construction site. The interior of the casket was filled halfway to the top with gray, dusty playground sand. Embedded in the sand were jagged pieces of broken red brick and chunks of concrete. It was garbage. It was rubble. It was the physical manifestation of how little they cared about my father. They hadn't even bothered to fill it with something respectful like stones or wood. They had filled it with trash because to them, my father was nothing more than weight to be moved around. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the cathedral. It started in the front row and rippled back like a wave. People stood up, their mouths open in shock. The loan sharks in the back row exchanged dark, furious glances. The investors looked at each other, their faces draining of color as they realized the collateral for their loans was quite literally dirt. "Where is he?" someone shouted from the middle of the room. "Where is Jasper King?" "Is this a joke?" another voice cried out. The confusion turned into anger instantly. The solemnity of the funeral evaporated, replaced by the chaotic energy of a mob that had been cheated. Blake stared into the box. His eyes were fixed on a piece of broken brick sticking out of the sand. He looked like he had been punched in the gut. He swayed on his feet, his hands trembling at his sides. The reality of his situation crashed down on him. There was no body. That meant there was no death certificate verification. That meant there was no insurance payout. That meant there was no money. He looked up and his eyes darted around the room. He saw the angry faces of the creditors. He saw the sheriff standing by the empty casket. He saw his wife sobbing in the arms of a deputy. He realized with a jolt of pure adrenaline that he was trapped. He took a step back, then another. He turned his head, looking toward the side exit near the vestry. It was a door usually reserved for the priest. If he could get there, he could get to the parking lot. He could get to his car. He could run. He didn't care about Jasmine. He didn't care about the scandal. He just wanted to survive. He started to move faster, his walk turning into a jog. He pushed past an elderly woman, nearly knocking her over. He was a rat fleeing a sinking ship, abandoning everything he had claimed to love. "Hey," the sheriff shouted, spotting him. "Stop him!" But Blake was already halfway to the door, his hand reaching for the latch. He was going to run. He was going to leave us all behind to clean up his mess. Then a sound cut through the chaos. It was a sound so sharp and commanding that it froze everyone in place. Tap, tap, tap. It was the sound of hard wood striking marble. It was a slow, rhythmic beat. It came from the shadows behind the altar, from the area concealed by heavy velvet curtains. Tap, tap, tap. Blake froze his hand, hovering inches from the door handle. He turned slowly, his eyes wide with a terror that went beyond the fear of prison. It was the fear of the supernatural. It was the fear of a ghost coming to claim its due. The crowd fell silent. The sobbing stopped. The shouting died away. The only sound in the massive cathedral was that steady, relentless tapping. Tap, tap, tap. The heavy purple curtains behind the altar began to move. A hand appeared gripping the fabric. It was a strong, weathered hand. The curtain was pulled back with a sudden, violent motion. A shaft of sunlight from the high window hit the spot, perfectly illuminating the figure that stepped out. It was Jasper King. He was not burned. He was not broken. He was not dead. He was wearing a pristine white linen suit that seemed to glow in the light. His silver hair was combed back perfectly. He stood tall, his back straight, his shoulders squared. He held a polished ebony cane in one hand, but he didn't lean on it. He used it like a scepter. He looked like a king returning to his throne. He looked powerful. He looked healthy. And he looked absolutely furious. His eyes swept the room. They burned with a cold fire that seemed to scorch everything it touched. He looked at the sand in the casket with a sneer of disgust. He looked at his weeping granddaughter with disappointed judgment. And then he looked at Blake. Blake let out a sound that was half whimper, half scream. He backed up until he hit the stone wall, sliding down it slightly, his legs giving way. He looked like he was seeing the devil himself. Jasper walked forward. He moved to the microphone stand that Jasmine had used to weave her web of lies. He gripped it, his knuckles standing out against his dark skin. The feedback from the speakers whined for a second, a high-pitched shriek that made everyone wince. Jasper waited. He let the silence stretch until it was almost unbearable. He wanted them to look at him. He wanted them to see that the man they had tried to erase was more alive than any of them. He leaned into the microphone. His voice, when it came, was deep, resonant, and filled with the power of a man who had built an empire from nothing. "You vultures!" he thundered, his voice booming through the cathedral, shaking the dust from the rafters. He pointed a finger at the crowd, at the family, at the liars. "I am not dead yet." The words hit the room like a physical blow. People gasped, clutching their chests. Jasmine stopped breathing, her face going slack with shock. Blake slid all the way to the floor, sitting in a heap of expensive fabric and cheap fear. Jasper continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "You came here to bury me. You came here to divide my life into shares and sell me off. You thought you could erase 92 years of blood and sweat with a box of sand and a fake piece of paper." He looked directly at Blake. "You thought I was a senile old fool. You thought you could starve my son. You thought you could steal my house. But you forgot one thing, boy." Jasper smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. "You forgot that I built this town, and I know how to bury trash." He stepped back from the microphone, and the echo of his voice hung in the air like a judgment. The resurrection was complete. The dead man had spoken. And now the reckoning was about to begin. Jasper stood alone at the altar, a figure of righteous judgment bathed in the light of the stained glass. The cathedral was silent, but it was the silence of a held breath, the silence before an explosion. He raised his hand not to bless the congregation, but to signal the back of the room where Mercer stood by the audio-visual controls. The massive projection screen that hung above the choir loft, usually reserved for hymns and soft focus photos of the deceased, flickered to life. The static buzzed for a second, a harsh electronic noise that made the front row wince. Then the image clarified. It was grainy footage taken from a hidden camera inside a luxury SUV. The audience gasped as they recognized the interior of Blake and Jasmine's car. The audio boomed through the church speakers, amplified to a deafening volume. It was the conversation I had recorded the night they argued about the missing money. "I only married you for the payout," Blake's voice snarled from the speakers, his face twisted in a sneer on the giant screen. "Without me, you are just another black girl from the South with a famous last name and no class." The racism hung in the air, naked and ugly. The socialites in the pews covered their mouths. The business partners Blake had tried to impress looked at him with undisguised disgust. But the video didn't stop there. It cut to a new scene. This one was darker shot in low light. It was the kitchen of my rental apartment the night Jasmine broke in. The camera angle was low, looking up from the closet where I had hidden. "Just die so I can be free," Jasmine's voice shrieked on the recording. "Why do you have to exist?" We watched as she stomped on my military medal, as she tore up the letters from my mother. The violence of her actions was magnified on the screen. The sound of her boot grinding into the metal echoed through the holy space like a sacrilege. Then came the final clip. It was audio only, but it was the most damning of all. It was the recording from the hospital room, the whisper I had captured when they thought I was unconscious. "If the old man doesn't die fast enough, we help him along." Blake's voice whispered, "A little too much morphine. A pillow over the face. Accidents happen at that age." The video cut to black. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a tomb. Jasper leaned back into the microphone. His eyes were wet, not with tears, but with the sheer weight of the betrayal. "You wanted a tribute," he said, his voice trembling with controlled rage. "You wanted to show the world who we were. Well, now they know. They know that you are not grieving grandchildren. You are predators. You hated my skin. You hated my history. You hated my son. The only thing you loved was the money you thought we had." He pointed a shaking finger at the crowd. "Look at them," he commanded. "Look at the people who wanted to murder me in my sleep. Look at the people who called my son a failure." People began to stand up. It wasn't a slow exit. It was a stampede of social distancing. No one wanted to be near Blake and Jasmine. The loan sharks were the first to move, slipping out the side doors, pulling their phones out to cancel deals and call in debts. The investors looked sick. They realized they had been doing business with monsters. Some of them pulled out their phones not to call for help, but to record the downfall. They were filming the ruin of the King family for the evening news. Blake tried to stand up. He looked around wildly, realizing his reputation was incinerated. "It is a fake," he shouted, his voice cracking. "That is deep fake technology. They doctored the audio. It is a lie." But no one was listening. The truth was too visceral, too ugly to be manufactured. Jasmine just sat on the floor, her dress ruined, her makeup running, staring at the blank screen as if she could rewind time. Jasper stepped back from the podium. He looked at me. It was my turn. I walked up the marble steps. I felt the eyes of the room on me. They still saw the old man in the flannel shirt. They still saw the beggar Blake had described. I stopped next to my father. I looked at Blake, who was now backed against a pillar by two deputies. "You called me a failure, Blake," I said, my voice amplified by the acoustics of the church. "You told your friends I was a burden. You told them I lived in a swamp." I reached up and undid the top button of my old flannel shirt. I pulled it open. Underneath, I was wearing a white dress shirt made of Egyptian cotton. I shrugged the flannel off my shoulders, letting it fall to the floor like a shed skin. I reached down and unzipped the muddy work pants, stepping out of them to reveal the charcoal wool trousers of a bespoke Italian suit. I kicked off the dirty boots and slipped on the polished leather loafers I had hidden in the organ pit before the service. I straightened my tie. I put on the gold watch I had kept in my pocket, a watch my father had given me when I returned from war. I wasn't the gardener anymore. I wasn't the charity case. The transformation was physical, but it was also psychological. I stood straighter. I looked taller. "My name is Rufus King," I announced, "and I am not just a retired engineer." I looked at the crowd, at the bankers and builders who had ignored me for years. "I am the majority shareholder and chairman of Atlas Construction Group." A murmur of shock went through the remaining crowd. Atlas Construction was a giant. It was the company that built the highways they drove on, the skyscrapers they worked in, and the very church we were standing in. It was a billion-dollar entity. Blake's jaw dropped. He looked like he had been slapped. "Atlas," he whispered. "No, that is impossible. Atlas supplies my company. I buy my materials from Atlas." "Exactly," I said, cold and hard. "You owe my company $400,000 in unpaid invoices, Blake. I signed off on your credit line because I wanted to see what you would do. I wanted to see if you would build something or if you would steal." I took a step closer to him. "I own the concrete in your foundation," I said. "I own the steel in your walls. I own the debt you used to buy that boat this morning. You didn't just try to rob your grandfather. You tried to rob the man who owns the roof over your head." "You knew," Blake stammered. "You knew the whole time." "I knew everything," I said. "I knew you were a fraud, I knew you were a racist, and I knew you were broke. I let you live in your fantasy because I hoped my daughter would wake up. I hoped she would see you for what you were." I looked at Jasmine. She was looking at me with a mixture of awe and horror. She had grown up thinking I was simple. She had never asked where the money came from. She had never asked about the business. She had assumed that because I worked with my hands, I had nothing in my head. "Dad," she whispered, "you have millions." "I have a legacy," I corrected her. "A legacy you tried to burn. A legacy you tried to sell for pennies. You thought power looked like a Ferrari, Jasmine. You thought wealth looked like a designer bag. You didn't understand that real power is silent. Real wealth is having the patience to wait for the trap to spring." The sheriff stepped forward again. He had been waiting for the signal. He walked up to Blake and Jasmine, who were now huddled together, not in love, but in shared destruction. He pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt. The metal glinted in the church light. "Blake Johnson and Jasmine King," the sheriff said, his voice booming. "I have a warrant for your arrest." "What for?" Blake screamed, trying to pull away. "Fraud. That is a civil matter. I have lawyers. I will sue you." "It is not just fraud," the sheriff said, snapping the cuffs onto Blake's wrists. "And it is not just forgery." He looked at me, then back at the couple. "We have the forensic report from the Cadillac you tried to steal from the Atlanta garage. We found the brake lines. They weren't worn out. They were cut." The room went deadly silent. "Cut with a pair of wire cutters we found in your tool bench," Blake the sheriff continued. "You didn't just plan to stage an accident. You tried to cause one last week when Mr. King took the car out for a drive. You tried to kill him for real." Murder, Jasmine gasped, looking at her husband. "You cut the brakes. You told me it was just an idea. You told me you wouldn't do it." "You are an accomplice," the sheriff said, cuffing Jasmine as well. "You knew about the plan. You discussed it on the recording. Conspiracy to commit capital murder, attempted murder, insurance fraud, identity theft." The list of charges went on, each one a heavy stone adding to the weight that would crush them. "Attempted murder," I said, looking at my daughter. "You tried to kill the man who built this family. You tried to kill him for money you didn't earn." "I didn't mean it." Jasmine sobbed, her resistance finally breaking. "We were desperate, Dad. The lenders, they were going to hurt us. So you decided to hurt us instead," I said. You decided that my life and your grandfather's life were the price of your safety. I turned away from them. I couldn't look at them anymore. The sight of my daughter in handcuffs was a pain that no amount of victory could erase. But it was necessary. It was the only way to stop the rot. "Take them away," Jasper said from the pulpit. "Get them out of my sight." The deputies hauled them up the aisle. Blake was shouting threats, screaming about his lawyers, screaming that he had been set up. Jasmine was weeping, her head hanging low, her shame finally catching up with her. They were dragged past the empty casket, past the sand and the bricks, past the judgment of the crowd. As they reached the heavy oak doors, the doors they had hoped to walk out of as millionaires, the press cameras flashed. The reporters had arrived. They would be on the front page tomorrow, not as heirs, but as monsters. I stood at the altar with my father. We were two men in suits standing over a pile of sand. We had won. But as I watched the doors close behind my daughter, I knew that the cost of this victory would haunt me for the rest of my life. The truth was out. The exposure was complete. And now there was nothing left but the cleanup. The sound of handcuffs ratcheting tight is a unique mechanical click that signals the end of freedom and the beginning of a nightmare. For Blake and Jasmine, standing at the altar of the cathedral they had desecrated, it was the sound of their reality shattering into 1,000 irreparable pieces. The deputies held them firmly, but they did not need to use much force because the fight had drained out of them, replaced by a primal panic that turned them against each other instantly. They were no longer partners in crime. They were two drowning rats in a bucket climbing over each other to breathe. Blake was the first to break. The arrogance that had defined him for the 10 years I had known him evaporated, leaving behind a sniveling coward. He twisted his body away from Jasmine, straining against the grip of the deputy holding him. His face was a mask of sweat and terror. It was her he screamed, his voice cracking and echoing off the stone walls. "I didn't want to do any of this. She made me. She is the blood relative. She is the one who hated him." Jasmine's head snapped up. Her eyes, which had been filled with tears a moment before, went wide with shock and then narrowed into a hatred so pure it was terrifying to witness. "You liar!" she shrieked, lunging at him. "You are the one with the gambling debts. You are the one who owes the syndicate. You told me we had to do this or they would kill us." "I didn't cut the brakes," Blake shouted back, desperate to distance himself from the attempted murder charge. "That was your idea. You said the old man lived too long. You said he was wasting our inheritance. Officer, listen to me. I am just the husband. I just did what she told me. She is the mastermind. She hates her family. You heard the recording. She stomped on her father metal. Who does that? Only a monster does that. He was using her own sins against her sins. He had encouraged sins he had cultivated. He was throwing her into the fire to save his own skin." "You son of a bitch," Jasmine yelled, spitting in his face. "You told me you loved me. You told me we were a team." "Duh. I never loved you," Blake laughed, a manic, hysterical sound. "I love the money, but there is no money, is there? There is just sand in a box and a prison cell. You are useless to me, Jasmine. You are just a broke girl from a family of lunatics." The deputies had to physically separate them, dragging them apart as they clawed and cursed at each other. It was a pathetic display. The facade of the power couple, the image of the successful real estate developer and his elegant wife, was gone. In its place were two vicious creatures exposing their rot to the world. I watched from the altar steps, standing next to my father. I felt no satisfaction, only a deep, hollow sadness. This was my daughter. This screaming, clawing woman was the child I had raised, and she had married a man who would sell her out for a plea deal in a heartbeat. They deserved each other, and that was the worst punishment of all. Jasmine realized that Blake was a lost cause. She realized that he was sinking and he was trying to take her down with him. She looked around the room, searching for a lifeline. She saw the disgusted faces of the investors. She saw the stone-cold faces of the police, and then her eyes landed on Jasper. My father stood there, leaning on his cane, watching the spectacle with the impassive judgment of a king. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked disappointed. And to a child, disappointment is always worse than anger. Jasmine stopped fighting the deputy. She let her body go limp, dropping to her knees on the hard marble floor. She began to crawl. The expensive black dress she had worn to play the part of the grieving heiress dragged through the dust. Her makeup was smeared down her face in dark streaks. She looked like a ghost. "Grandpa," she sobbed, reaching out a hand toward him. "Grandpa, please." She crawled until she was at the hem of his white linen suit. She reached out to touch his shoe, but pulled back at the last second, afraid to make contact. "I am sorry," She wept, her voice broken and small. I was confused. Blake confused me. He told me we had no choice. He told me you would understand. I didn't mean to hurt you. I love you, Grandpa. Please tell them to let me go. You can fix this. You have the money. You can make this go away. She was still doing it. Even in her apology, she was asking for money. She was asking him to use his power to save her from the consequences of her own hatred. Jasper looked down at her. He didn't step away, but he didn't reach down to help her up. He looked at the granddaughter he had bounced on his knee, the girl whose tuition he had paid the woman who had tried to kill him for a payout. You love me? Jasper asked, his voice soft but carrying to the back of the silent church. You love me so much you planned to suffocate me with a pillow. You love me so much you called me a useless eater. That was Blake, Jasmine pleaded. I never said that. You stood by while he said it, Jasper corrected her. You stood by while he cut the brakes. You stood by while he looted my house. Silence is consent, Jasmine, and your silence was bought with the promise of my money. He looked up at the ceiling, taking a breath as if the air in the room was tainted. You want the money, Jasper said, looking back down at her. That is all this has ever been about. The $8 million, the land, the legacy. Yes, Jasmine whispered, thinking she saw an opening, thinking she could still negotiate. If I have the money, I can pay the debts. I can get away from Blake. I can start over Grandpa. I can be better. Jasper reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a folded document. It was the trust agreement he had drawn up with Mercer weeks ago, the fail-safe in case his suspicions were proved right. Do you know what this is? Jasper asked, holding the paper up. Jasmine shook her head, hope lighting a tiny spark in her eyes. This is the disposition of the Jasper King estate, Jasper announced. It details exactly where every penny of my fortune goes upon my death. He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. I am donating it, Jasper said, his voice hard as iron. Every single dime. The house in Atlanta, the lake property, the investment accounts, the $8 million you killed for, it is all going to the Viola King Scholarship Fund. Jasmine gasped as if he had struck her. No, she whispered. It will pay for the education of underprivileged black children. Jasper continued, his eyes burning with a fierce light. Children who know the value of hard work. Children who know that history is something to be proud of, not erased. Children who would never dream of poisoning the hand that feeds them. He ripped the paper in half, then in half again, letting the pieces fall like snow onto Jasmine's head. I would rather stack my money in the parking lot and set it on fire than give you a single copper penny, Jasper said. I would rather burn it all down than let you use it to buy your way out of hell. You are not my heir, Jasmine. You are a stranger, and you are broke. Jasmine collapsed onto the floor, wailing. It was the sound of a woman who had gambled her soul and lost. She realized finally that there was no safety net. There was no grandfather to bail her out. There was only the cold, hard floor and the prison cell waiting for her. The wailing of my daughter was a terrible sound, but it was cut short by the sharp, clear voice of Mercer. He stepped forward, flanked by two forensic accountants who had entered the church behind the police. He held a tablet in his hand, and he looked at Blake and Jasmine with the clinical detachment of an executioner. We are not done, Mercer stated. The criminal charges are just the beginning. We need to discuss the civil liabilities. Blake looked up from where the deputy was holding him. Civil liabilities, he spat. I am going to jail. What more do you want? We want everything, Mercer said. He tapped the screen of his tablet. As of 10 minutes ago, Mercer announced, addressing the room, a majestic order of attachment was executed on all assets held by Blake Johnson and Jasmine King. This order was granted based on the undeniable evidence of fraud committed against the Atlas Construction Group and the Jasper King Trust. He looked at Blake, who was starting to tremble again. That Ferrari you put a deposit on, Mercer said. The dealership has already voided the contract and kept the money. The boat. Gone. The luxury condo you live in. We just spoke to the landlord. Since your lease was secured with fraudulent financial statements and the guarantee from Rufus has been revoked, you are being evicted immediately. Your possessions are being seized to pay off the outstanding rent and damages. He turned his gaze to Jasmine. Your jewelry, Mercer listed, your designer clothes, your car. It has all been flagged as proceeds of crime or assets purchased with stolen funds. It is all being seized. He walked closer to them, invading their space. And the debts, Mercer said, his voice dropping. The $500,000 you owe to the syndicate, The money you borrowed from the sharks. Blake went white. He knew what that meant. Mr. King bought that debt, Mercer said, pointing to Jasper. He owns your note, Blake, and he is calling it in immediately. Since you cannot pay, he is exercising his right to seize any remaining assets to satisfy the judgment. But I have nothing left. Blake stammered, tears streaming down his face. You took everything. Exactly, Mercer said, closing the tablet cover with a snap. You have nothing. You are going to prison with $0 in your commissary account. You will have no money for a private lawyer, so you will use a public defender. You will have no house to come back to in 20 years. You will have no car. You will have no name. Mercer looked at the deputies. Check their pockets, he ordered. The deputies patted them down. From Blake's pocket, they pulled a gold money clip with a few $100s. From Jasmine's wrist, they unclasped a diamond bracelet. From Blake's finger, they pulled his wedding ring. That belongs to the estate, Mercer said, taking the items. It was bought with stolen money. Jasmine watched her bracelet disappear into an evidence bag. It was the last symbol of her status, the last piece of the armor she wore to pretend she was better than us. Without it, she looked small and ordinary. You stripped us, Blake whispered, his voice full of disbelief. You stripped us bare. You stripped yourselves, Jasper said from the altar. You traded your honor for things. Now you have neither. The sheriff signaled to his men. It is time, he said. Get them out of here. They hauled them up. Blake was sobbing openly, now his legs dragging on the floor. Jasmine was silent, in a state of shock, her eyes staring at nothing. They were marched down the aisle, past the empty casket, past the sand, past the people they had tried to impress. I watched them go. I watched the heavy doors open and the flashbulbs pop outside. I watched my daughter disappear into the back of a police cruiser. I felt a tear run down my cheek, but I didn't wipe it away. I let it fall. It was the last tear I would shed for them. The doors closed, sealing the noise of the world outside. The church was quiet again. I looked at my father. He looked tired. He looked all of his 92 years. But he was standing. He was alive. And we were still here. We walked out of the church together, leaving the sand and the lies behind us. We had destroyed them, yes, but we had saved ourselves. And in the end, that was the only victory that mattered. 6 months had passed since the gavel fell in the courtroom, but the echo of the sentence still seemed to ring in my ears. 15 years. That was the price tag the state had placed on their greed. 15 years without parole in a maximum security facility for conspiracy, fraud, and attempted murder. I stood outside the visitor processing center of the state penitentiary, not because I wanted to see them, but because I needed to see the end of the story with my own eyes. I needed to know that the monsters were truly in the cage. Through the reinforced glass of the secure transport area, I saw them being moved to their permanent blocks. They were no longer the power couple of Atlanta. They were inmates. Blake was wearing a jumpsuit that hung loosely on his frame. He had lost 30 pounds. His hair, which he used to style so carefully, was shaved close to his skull, revealing the pale skin beneath. He looked older. He looked broken. But he did not look sorry. As the guards shuffled him down the hallway, his chains clanking against the concrete floor, he turned his head. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the line of female prisoners being moved in the opposite direction. He was looking for Jasmine. And he found her. Jasmine was shuffling along in the same orange uniform, her face scrubbed clean of makeup, her eyes hollow and dark. She looked like a ghost of the woman who had stood at the altar. When their eyes met, I expected to see sadness. I expected to see a shared moment of regret between husband and wife. Instead, I saw pure, unadulterated hatred. Blake curled his lip in a sneer and mouthed a curse at her. He blamed her for everything. He blamed her for the plan. He blamed her for the recording. He blamed her for his ruined life. Jasmine didn't shrink away. She stared back at him with eyes that burned with a cold fury. She spat on the floor in his direction, a violation that earned her a shove from the guard. She hated him for spending the money. She hated him for the other woman. She hated him because he was the mirror that showed her exactly what she had become. They were separated by the guards, pushed through different steel doors that slammed shut with a finality that shook the ground. They would spend the next 15 years in the same building, blaming each other for their fate, never realizing that they were both architects of their own destruction. I turned away from the glass. I didn't feel happy. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt a heavy stone lift from my chest. It was over. The toxic link was severed. They were gone. I walked out of the prison into the bright sunlight, and for the first time in years, the air didn't taste like betrayal. It tasted like freedom. I drove back to the lake house. The drive was peaceful. The leaves were turning gold and red, signaling the arrival of autumn. When I pulled into the gravel driveway, I saw Jasper sitting on the porch. He wasn't in his wheelchair. He was sitting in his favorite rocking chair, a fishing rod resting against his knee, a cup of coffee in his hand. He looked at the truck as I parked and raised his mug in a silent salute. I walked up the steps and sat down beside him. The lake was a sheet of glass reflecting the sky. It was quiet. No phones ringing, no demands for money, no lies. "Did you see them?" Jasper asked, his voice calm and steady. "I saw them," I replied. "They hate each other, Pop. They hate each other more than they ever hated us." "Good," Jasper said, taking a sip of coffee. "Hate will keep them warm in there. It is the only thing they have left." He reached down beside his chair and picked up a metal bucket. Inside were papers. It wasn't money. It wasn't deeds. It was the past. It was the fake power of attorney Jasmine had tried to force me to sign. It was the old photos of Blake. It was the birthday cards Jasmine had sent over the years, cards that I now knew were just placeholders for requests for cash. "We don't need this anymore," Jasper said. "We don't need the reminders." He struck a match. The flame flared bright orange against the wood of the porch. He dropped it into the bucket. The dry paper caught instantly. We watched as the fire consumed the lies. We watched as Blake's signature turned to ash. We watched as the false promises of a daughter curled up and blackened into nothing. The smoke rose in a thin gray column, drifting out over the water and vanishing into the air. It felt like a cleansing. It felt like a funeral, but a good one. We were burying the burden we had carried for so long. "What about the money?" I asked, watching the last of the paper turn to dust. Jasper smiled. "It is already gone, Rufus. The Viola King Scholarship Fund was officially registered this morning. The first checks go out next week. 20 students from the neighborhood. 20 kids who wants to be doctors and engineers and teachers. Kids who know the value of $1. He looked at me, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "We kept enough to fix the roof on this cabin," he said. "And maybe buy a new boat. A fishing boat, not a yacht." I laughed. It was a real laugh, deep and loud. "A fishing boat sounds good, Pop." We sat there for a long time as the sun began to dip below the tree line. We didn't need to talk. We were two men who had fought a war and won. We had lost a family member, but we had saved the family. We had saved the dignity of our name. The fire in the bucket died down, leaving only a pile of dark ash. Jasper kicked the bucket gently. "Dump it in the woods," he said. "Let the rain wash it away." I took the bucket and walked to the edge of the clearing. I dumped the ashes into the underbrush. The wind caught the dust and scattered it. It was gone. Jasmine and Blake were just a memory, now a bad dream that had ended with the morning light. I walked back to the porch and sat down. Jasper poured me a cup of coffee from the thermos. The steam rose up, warming my face. "You know, Rufus," Jasper said, looking out at the water, "people think legacy is about what you leave behind in a bank account. They think it is about buildings and land." He took a sip and looked at me. "But legacy is about who you are when the storm comes. It is about standing your ground. It is about protecting the things that actually matter. You did good, son. You stood tall." "Thank you, Pop," I said, my throat tight. We clinked our mugs together. The ceramic made a solid, honest sound. I looked at my father. He was 92 years old. He had built an empire, he had lost a granddaughter, and he had almost lost his life. But he was still here. He was still the strongest man I knew. I thought about the lesson I had learned. I thought about the thousands of people who had watched my story online. I thought about the parents who were afraid of their own children. I hoped they learned what I had learned. I learned that blood does not give anyone the right to bleed you dry. I learned that love is not a transaction. And I learned that silence is not weakness. Sometimes silence is just the sound of a man reloading. We drank our coffee as the stars began to come out. The world was big and quiet and ours. We didn't have $8 million anymore. We didn't have a mansion in Atlanta, but we had peace, we had honor, and we had each other. And as I sat there next to my father, listening to the gentle lap of the water against the shore, I knew that I was the richest man in the world. So if you are listening to this, if you are dealing with people who treat you like an option instead of a priority, remember my story. Remember that you have the power to say no. You have the power to walk away, and you have the power to write your own ending. Don't let them bury you. Don't let them steal your joy. Stand up. Fight back. And if you have to burn the bridge to save yourself, strike the match and watch it burn. Because in the end, the only thing you take with you is your dignity. And that is something no one can steal unless you let them. I finished my coffee. Jasper started to hum a song, an old blues tune he used to sing when I was a boy. I joined in the low harmony. We sat in the dark singing to the lake, two free men enjoying the rest of our lives. The story of Jasmine and Blake was over. The story of Rufus and Jasper was just beginning again. And it was going to be a good story. I learned that silence is a shield, but action is a sword. For years, I let them mistake my quietness for weakness, my simplicity for poverty. But when they crossed the line, they found out that the quietest man in the room is often the one you should fear the most. Real family isn't determined by DNA, it's determined by respect. If someone treats you like an ATM or an obstacle, they don't deserve a seat at your table no matter whose blood runs in their veins. Walking away wasn't quitting, it was the ultimate victory. I reclaimed my peace, my dignity, and my future. If my story resonated with you, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments, what is the hardest boundary you have ever had to set with your family?